He noticed her from his driveway, coffee going cold in his hand, watching the procession of black vehicles roll past his beat-up pickup truck like a funeral for ordinary people. His 7-year-old daughter pressed her nose flat against the living room window and whispered, "Daddy, is a queen moving in?" Logan Pierce didn't have an answer for that. But the woman who stepped out of the last black SUV, straight-backed, dark-eyed, wearing a coat that probably cost more than his monthly mortgage, looked at the neighborhood like she was trying to decide whether it was a mistake. Then she looked directly at him. Neither of them looked away fast enough. This is the story of what happened after that moment, and how a single soccer ball, a little girl's question, and one very long, very dangerous year changed both of their lives forever. If this story finds something in you, drop a like, and tell me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this has traveled. Now, settle in. This one's going to take a while. The morning Vivian Sterling moved into the neighborhood, Logan Pierce was already in a bad mood. It wasn't anything dramatic. No single catastrophic event, just the accumulated weight of a Tuesday that had started 40 minutes before his alarm because Emma had crawled into his bed at 5:15 with cold feet and a bad dream she couldn't quite describe. "There was something chasing me, Daddy, but I don't know what it looked like," and had then refused to go back to sleep. So he'd lain there in the dark with a 7-year-old burrowed against his ribs, staring at the water stain on the ceiling he'd been meaning to fix for 2 months, listening to the neighborhood slowly wake up outside his window. By the time he got Emma fed and dressed, and her backpack zipped, and her lunch packed, turkey and Swiss, crusts cut off, one small bag of pretzels, a juice box, the same thing every day because Emma had decided this was the correct lunch and any deviation was a personal betrayal, he'd managed exactly half a mug of coffee. He was standing in the driveway in yesterday's jeans and a flannel he'd grabbed off the back of the bathroom door, watching Emma walk down the block toward the bus stop with her backpack bouncing, when the first black truck turned onto the street, then the second one, then the third. Logan counted. He stopped at 11 and gave up. The vehicles moved slowly, carefully, in the precise and deliberate way of people who were paid to be careful. The movers who climbed out of the cargo trucks wore matching black shirts and moved with the coordinated efficiency of people who did this for a living. Not part-time weekend movers, not guys you called from Craigslist. These were professionals. They had equipment Logan didn't recognize. They had earpieces. Earpieces. He stood in his driveway with his half mug of cold coffee and watched them begin carrying things into the house next door. The Victorian mansion that had sat empty for almost 8 months, ever since the Kellermans had moved to Phoenix to be closer to their grandchildren, and the real estate market had apparently decided that nobody in this particular tax bracket wanted a 7-bedroom house with original crown molding and a garden that took up a third of the lot. Logan had gotten used to the empty house. He'd gotten used to the quiet. The Kellermans had been good neighbors. Carol would bring over zucchini from her garden every summer, whether you wanted it or not. And Bill had once helped Logan replace a water heater at 9 o'clock on a Sunday night without being asked. But they were gone, and the house had been empty, and there was something almost peaceful about having that absence next door. No noise, no expectations, just a beautiful old house sitting there minding its own business. That was apparently over. The last vehicle in the convoy was a black SUV that looked like it was armored. It pulled up to the front of the mansion and idled for a moment before the rear door opened. The woman who stepped out was, Logan searched for the right word and kept landing on precise. That was the thing about her, even from a distance. She was precise. The coat was dark and perfectly cut. Her hair was pulled back in a way that looked effortless but probably wasn't. She stood on the sidewalk in front of the mansion with her hands at her sides, looking up at the house, and there was something in the way she held herself that Logan couldn't quite read. Not warmth, not coldness, but something controlled. Like someone who had learned to keep the weather off her face. Then she turned and looked directly at him. He didn't know why he didn't look away. Social protocol would have been to look away. He'd been caught staring, obviously, and the polite thing was to find something else to look at, to pretend sudden fascination with the left rear tire of his truck or something. But he didn't, and she didn't. It lasted maybe 3 seconds, maybe 4. Then one of the men in black shirts materialized at her elbow and said something, and she turned back to the house, and Logan finally looked down at his coffee and realized it was completely cold. He went inside. He had a job to get to. His name was Logan Pierce, and he was 32 years old, and he did not think of himself as a man with a story. He thought of himself as a man with a schedule. Monday, Wednesday, Friday, job sites. He worked freelance construction, framing, renovation, the occasional full build if the project was right. He wasn't a foreman or a project manager. He was the guy they called when they needed someone who could read a blueprint without help, frame a wall without asking questions, and show up on time regardless of weather. He was good at what he did in the particular way of people who had learned their work from the ground up rather than from a classroom, and he'd built enough of a reputation in the past 4 years that he usually had more work than he could take on. Tuesday, Thursday. Flexible, depending on Emma's school schedule, which he kept in a paper calendar on the refrigerator because he'd tried the phone apps and kept forgetting to check them. Weekends. Emma. Fully. Completely. Without negotiation. That was the structure of his life, and he'd built it deliberately, the same way he built everything, one piece at a time, checking the levels as he went, making sure nothing was crooked before he moved on. Structure was what Emma needed. Structure was what he'd promised her, in the oblique way that adults make promises to small children who won't remember the specific words, but will carry the weight of whether the promise was kept. Emma's mother, her name was Rachel, and Logan still had trouble saying it in the present tense, had left when Emma was 2. Not dramatically, not with a fight or a revelation or even a clean break. She had simply reached a point where the life she'd built with Logan was no longer the life she wanted, and she had said so with a directness that he'd respected even as it was destroying him, and then she had left. She was in Denver now, he thought. They didn't speak much. Emma knew her mother existed and knew that she was somewhere else, and at 7 she was still in the stage of processing that fact with the particular philosophical acceptance of children, which mostly meant she didn't bring it up unless she was tired or sick or had seen something at school that reminded her. Logan had made a decision early on, so early that it felt less like a decision and more like a reflex, that Emma would not grow up in the shadow of that absence. She would grow up in the light of what they had, the two of them, their life together. The Tuesday mornings with cold feet and bad dreams, the school lunches with the crust cut off, the weekend afternoons at the park where she had recently decided to become a soccer player with the same absolute conviction she'd previously applied to wanting to be a marine biologist. He had a small house, he had a reliable truck, he had work he was good at and a daughter he loved with the specific terrifying intensity of a person who has organized their entire life around a single point. He was not looking for anything to change. It changed anyway, as things do, on a Saturday afternoon about 3 weeks after the 17 moving trucks. Emma had been practicing her soccer in the backyard, which was a generous description of what was actually happening, since practicing soccer at 7 mostly meant kicking the ball at full strength in random directions and then chasing it with enormous enthusiasm. Logan was on the back porch replacing a board that had been rotting for longer than he wanted to admit, half watching her, mostly focused on the wood. He heard the kick. He heard the particular sound of a soccer ball connecting with something it wasn't supposed to connect with. The specific thwunk of ball against fence, followed by the sound of old boards flexing and giving, and then he heard silence, which was worse than any sound Emma could have made. "Daddy?" He looked up. Emma was standing at the back fence, staring at the gap where 2 boards had separated under the impact. The soccer ball was gone. Through the gap, just barely visible, was a section of the neighboring yard, the mansion's garden, which was substantial and well-maintained in the way of gardens that had professional help. "It went over," Emma said. Her voice had the careful quality of a child who was trying to assess exactly how much trouble she was in. "I can see that." "I didn't mean to." "I know. Are we going to get in trouble?" Logan set down the sander and looked at the fence. The boards had been weak for a while. He'd been meaning to fix them. He couldn't entirely blame Emma. "We should go get the ball," he said. "You can't just leave it in someone's yard." Emma looked at the gap in the fence, then at the mansion looming beyond, then back at him. "What if she's scary?" "She's just a person, Em." "She has guards. They're not guards. They have earpieces." Logan couldn't argue with that. "Come on," he said. "We'll go around to the front, ring the doorbell like normal people." He didn't think much of it. He'd seen the neighbor, Or he'd seen a version of her from a distance 3 weeks ago. He didn't know who she was. He'd been busy. He hadn't looked her up, hadn't asked around, hadn't paid the kind of attention that his neighbor Carol from 2 doors down, who was approximately 63 years old and knew everything about everybody within a half-mile radius, would have paid. He was a man who minded his own business, and the mansion next door had been busy and noisy for 3 weeks, but not obnoxiously so, and he'd had work and Emma and the rotting porch board to think about. He took Emma's hand and they went around the block. The gate at the front of the mansion was heavy iron and looked new. There was an intercom panel beside it that also looked new. Logan pressed the button. A man's voice answered, professional and flat. Yes? Hi, I'm Logan Pierce. I live next door. My daughter's soccer ball went over your fence into the yard. We were wondering if we could get it back. A pause. The pause felt longer than it needed to be. Then a different voice. And this one wasn't coming through the intercom. It was coming from about 6 feet away, from the other side of the gate, which was swinging open. The ball's in the rose garden, the woman said. I had it moved before someone tripped over it. Vivian Sterling in person was different from the impression Logan had gotten from a distance. She was smaller than he'd expected, though that wasn't exactly the right word. More contained, maybe. She was wearing clothes that were clearly expensive but less formal than the coat from 3 weeks ago. Dark slacks, a simple top, and her hair was down, which for some reason surprised him. She looked at him with dark eyes that were direct without being aggressive, evaluative without being unkind. She looked at Emma, and something in her expression shifted almost imperceptibly. Not softened, exactly. More like registered. I'm Logan, he said. Logan Pierce. This is Emma. I know, she said. I've seen you through the fence, which was an interesting thing to admit. Logan noted it and filed it away. You have roses? Emma said, immediately interested. Emma was at the age where she would say anything directly to any adult without any of the social filters that humans spend years installing. Logan both loved this and found it mildly terrifying. Several kinds, the woman said. Do you want to see them while your father gets the ball? Emma looked up at Logan. He looked at the woman, Vivian, though he didn't know her name yet. She was watching him with an expression that seemed to understand exactly what he was doing, which was running a rapid background check with his eyes. Who are you? Can I trust you? Why do you have earpieces on your staff? She didn't seem bothered by the scrutiny. She simply waited. Sure, he said, because what else was he going to say? Thank you. Vivian, she said, extending a hand. Vivian Sterling. He shook it. Logan Pierce. She turned and led them through the gate, and one of the men in black shirts materialized from somewhere. Logan had no idea where he'd come from, and fell into step behind them, and Logan thought, I'm going to need to ask Carol about this woman. The garden was extraordinary. Logan didn't know much about gardens. He knew enough to understand when one had been designed rather than simply grown, and this one had been designed with serious intention. The roses Carol mentioned were only part of it. There were sections of other plants Logan couldn't name, a small pond that caught the afternoon light in a way that seemed almost deliberate, gravel paths between the beds that were neat without being sterile. Emma walked along the paths with her hands clasped behind her back in the exaggerated seriousness of a child trying to behave well, looking at everything. Vivian walked beside her at a slightly slower pace than she'd walked through the gate, as if she'd adjusted her speed to accommodate a 7-year-old without making a production of it. What's that one? Emma asked, stopping in front of a rose that was almost black at the edges and deep red at the center. That's a black baccarat, Vivian said. It's technically very dark red, but in certain light it looks almost purple. It's beautiful. It is. Does it smell? Vivian actually crouched, in her expensive slacks, right down to Emma's level, and cupped one of the blooms carefully without picking it. Try. Emma leaned in, sniffed, and made a face. It doesn't smell like roses. No, Vivian agreed, standing. It was bred for color, not fragrance. You can't always have both. Logan had found the soccer ball. It was sitting at the edge of the rose garden where someone had carefully moved it off the path and was holding it under his arm, and he was watching this exchange with the specific attention of a man who was trying to figure something out and didn't yet have enough information. Emma moved on to the next rows. Vivian followed. "She's yours?" Vivian asked, not looking back at Logan. "Yes. She's remarkable." "She really is," he said, and he meant it the way he meant it every single time he said it, which was absolutely. Vivian glanced back at him. There was something in the look that he couldn't parse. Not pity, not wistfulness, not the particular expression of people who knew about Rachel and were trying to decide whether to mention it. Something else. Something closer to recognition, though that didn't quite make sense. "We should let you get back to your afternoon," Logan said, because he was a man who knew when he'd overstayed or was about to. "Of course." Vivian turned from the roses. "Emma, it was nice to meet you." "You too," Emma said. Then, "Can we come back and see the rest of the garden sometime? My dad says I might like gardening, but I don't know yet if I do." "Emma," Logan started. "If your father doesn't mind," Vivian said, looking at Logan again with that calm, direct look that he was starting to find more readable. It was the look of someone who was asking for permission without asking for it. Logan looked at his daughter's face, the open, bright, thoroughly unguarded expression of a kid who had just found something interesting in the world and was hoping the adults weren't going to ruin it, and said, "Sure, we'll see." Which was how he always started things he wasn't sure about. "We'll see." It was the buffer between a yes and a no, the time he gave himself to check his levels before committing to a structure. They walked back through the gate. Emma tucked her hand into his as they headed down the sidewalk. She was quiet for half a block, which for Emma meant she was thinking hard about something. "She's sad," Emma said. Logan looked down. "What makes you say that?" "I don't know, just something in her eyes." Emma thought about it. "Like when you look sad but you're trying not to let me see." He didn't have an answer for that either. He put his hand on top of her head gently, the way he did sometimes when she said something that got past his defenses. "Come on," he said. "I'll make dinner." That night, after Emma was asleep, Logan finally did what he should have done 3 weeks ago. He sat at his kitchen table with his laptop and typed Vivian Sterling's name into a search engine. He stared at the results for a long moment. Then he got up and made himself a drink, which he almost never did on a Saturday night, and sat back down and read. Vivian Sterling, 30 years old, founder and CEO of Sterling Nexus, one of the fastest-growing technology companies in the country, cloud infrastructure, enterprise software, a recent expansion into cybersecurity that had tripled their valuation. She had built the company from a 2-person startup in a sublet office when she was 23, had turned down 3 acquisition offers before her 28th birthday, and was currently worth, depending on which outlet you were reading, somewhere between $8 and $12 billion. There were profile pieces, a lot of them. Forbes, Fast Company, The Wall Street Journal. She photographed well. Every picture showed the same composed, direct expression she'd worn in the garden, though the settings were conference rooms and award ceremonies and the occasional, very expensive-looking dinner. There was very little personal information. The profiles mentioned that she was private. One of them described her as famously difficult to know. There were no photographs with romantic partners. There was mention of parents she rarely discussed, a small detail about having grown up in a working-class household in Ohio that she'd managed to parlay into a bootstrap narrative that business journalists loved, though she'd apparently shut down anyone who tried to dig into the specifics. She had moved next door to him, to his small house with the rotting porch board and the paper calendar on the refrigerator and the single father and the 7-year-old who thought she was sad. He closed the laptop. He had work tomorrow. He needed to sleep. He lay awake for a long time. The second time they spoke, Vivian came to his door. It was about a week later, a Thursday evening, and Logan was on the porch finally replacing the boards he'd been putting off, working by the orange light of the porch fixture, Emma inside watching something on her tablet with headphones on. He heard footsteps on the sidewalk and looked up, and Vivian was standing at the bottom of his porch steps in a coat and what appeared to be slightly less composed hair than usual, which is to say she had a strand out of place, which for her might as well have been dishevelment. "Hi," she said. "Hi." He set down the sander. She looked at the boards he was replacing. You're good at that. It's what I do. Construction? Renovation, mostly. Framing, some finish work. He leaned against the porch rail. Did you need something? She seemed for a moment to consider how to answer that. He had the sense that she was someone who had gotten very good at knowing what she needed in professional contexts. Board meetings, negotiations, the kind of conversations where preparation was everything. And that this was a different kind of conversation, and she wasn't entirely sure what the rules were. I wanted to apologize, she said. For what? For the week you moved in, when you brought Emma over for the ball. I wasn't very warm. Logan thought about it. You were fine. I'm not very good at... She stopped, started again. I'm aware that I can come across as... Another stop. You were fine, he said again, because it was true, and also because he'd gotten the impression she wasn't someone who took well to people trying to smooth things over for her, and he didn't want to smooth anything over. He wanted to be accurate. She looked at him. You're not going to tell me I was lovely and welcoming and perfectly warm? Were you? A pause. Then something happened at the corner of her mouth that wasn't quite a smile, but was in the general neighborhood. No, she said. I wasn't. Okay, he said. So that's what it was. No harm done. She looked at him a little longer, with that same evaluative quality he'd noticed the first time, like she was trying to place him in a category and kept not being able to. Your daughter, she said. Emma. I've been thinking about what she said, about the roses. What did she say about the roses? Not the roses specifically. She said, about the black baccarat. She said it was beautiful, and then she tried to smell it, and it didn't smell the way she expected, and she was disappointed. Vivian paused. She didn't pretend it smelled like something it didn't. She just said so. Straightforwardly. She does that, Logan said. Says what she actually thinks. It's going to either be her superpower or her catastrophe, depending on the day. I liked it. Vivian said it simply, without decoration. Most people, adults especially, they would have said it smelled lovely and moved on. Emma said it didn't smell the way she expected. She's 7, Logan said. She hasn't figured out yet that you're supposed to lie about things. When does that happen? He thought about it. Different times for different people. Somewhere between 8 and... He glanced at her. Whenever. Something shifted in her expression. Not quite amusement, but close. I should let you get back to your porch. Appreciate it. She turned to go, then turned back. For what it's worth, the garden is open if Emma wants to come back. There's a section in the back with butterfly bush that I think she'd like. I'll tell her. She nodded once and walked back up the sidewalk. He watched until she reached the gate of the mansion and disappeared through it. He stood there for a minute, hands in his pockets, looking at the gate. Then he went back to the porch board. Check. The third time they spoke, it was because Emma engineered it. This was not obvious at the time. What appeared to happen on a Saturday afternoon 11 days after Vivian had come to the door was that Emma announced with great conviction that she had decided she wanted to learn about gardens, and that she wanted to ask the neighbor with the roses because the neighbor with the roses clearly knew what she was doing, and could they please go over. Logan, who knew his daughter very well, suspected this was not entirely spontaneous. He suspected there had been more thinking going on behind those eyes than Emma was letting on, but he could not prove it, and Emma's expression was the particular expression of a 7-year-old who has planned something and covered her tracks reasonably well, and he found he didn't want to undermine it. So they went. Vivian answered the gate intercom herself this time. She showed up at the gate in clothes that were, for Vivian, casual, which still meant a pressed linen shirt, but the sleeves were rolled up, and she was wearing gardening gloves that had actual dirt on them, which was the most human thing Logan had seen from her so far. She said she wanted to learn about the garden, Logan said, as if this required explanation. I heard, Vivian said, looking at Emma. Do you want a real lesson or the quick tour? Real lesson, Emma said immediately. Then you'll need gloves. Emma's face lit up. Vivian produced a small pair of gardening gloves from somewhere. They were clearly children's gloves, pink with small flower prints, and Logan had absolutely no idea where she'd gotten them. and suspected she had bought them before this visit, which he chose not to examine too closely. And Emma put them on with great seriousness. For an hour and a half, Vivian showed Emma things, not performed showing, not the tour guide version where you point at things and explain them. Real showing. She got down on her knees in the dirt beside Emma and demonstrated how to tell a dead branch from a dormant one, how to cup a bloom to smell without damaging it, how to read whether a plant needed water by the color of the soil around its base. Emma listened with the total, almost alarming focus that she brought to things she actually cared about, and she asked questions. Good questions, the kind that meant she was actually tracking. Logan sat on a bench near the pond and watched. He was watching his daughter, mostly. That was true. But he was also watching Vivian. She had a quality around Emma that she didn't have with him. Less controlled, or differently controlled, or maybe controlled in a different direction. She wasn't performing warmth. She was just present with Emma in a way that seemed to cost her something. In a good way, the way presence always costs something when it's real. At one point, Emma said, with complete seriousness, "Do you have kids?" Vivian was silent for a moment. She was pressing a small bulb into the soil, and she kept pressing it in, smoothing the dirt over it, before she answered. "No," she said, "I don't." "Why not?" "Emma," Logan said. "It's all right." Vivian looked at Emma with a steadiness that Logan recognized as the kind of steadiness you build rather than find. "I've been very focused on my work for a long time. I haven't had much time for other things." Emma considered this. "My dad works a lot too, but he always has time for me. Your dad is clearly better at balancing things than I am." Emma looked over at Logan across the garden. "He is," she said with straightforward conviction. "He's really good at a lot of things." Logan looked at the pond. Vivian looked at him. He felt the look without seeing it, and he decided he needed to go get a drink of water or do something useful with his hands before this got complicated. The complication started about 3 weeks after that. Not between them? Not exactly. Between Vivian and the world outside the fence, which began, slowly and then all at once, to intrude. The first thing Logan noticed was a car that didn't belong. A dark sedan parked about half a block down on a Thursday morning when he was getting Emma into the truck for the school drop-off. He noticed it the way he noticed things out of place at job sites, not consciously cataloging it, just registering that something was wrong with the picture. The car was there again the next morning. Different spot. He mentioned it to Vivian the next time he saw her, which was through the fence. Emma had insisted on daily watering updates of the bulb she'd planted, which had become a loose framework for more conversations than Logan had entirely planned for. He said it casually, the way you mentioned something that might be nothing. Vivian's reaction was not casual. She went still for a moment, just a fraction of a second, the kind of stillness that Logan had learned to notice because he'd been paying more attention to her over the past few weeks than he was strictly comfortable admitting. Then her face smoothed back into its composed default. "I'll have someone take a look," she said. "Vivian, it's probably nothing." "You didn't look like you think it's nothing." She looked at him. "It's being handled." "Okay," he said, which was not agreement. It was acknowledgement that she'd decided not to tell him more, and he wasn't going to push past that because they weren't, he reminded himself, the kind of close where he had the standing to push. They were neighbors who had moved into something that was more than neighbor territory, but hadn't yet been named, and that unnamed quality was something he was proceeding carefully around. But he kept his eyes open. That was just how he was built. It was Carol, eventually, who gave him the first real piece of information. Carol was 63, retired, knew everything, and had figured out Vivian's identity within approximately 48 hours of the 17 trucks arriving. She caught Logan one morning while he was coming back from a run, before he'd even caught his breath, and said without preamble, "Did you know there are news vans 2 blocks over?" "No," Logan said. 3 of them. "Been there since yesterday afternoon." Carol folded her arms. "She's Vivian Sterling, you know, the technology billionaire." "I know who she is." Carol looked at him. "How long have you known?" "Since she moved in." "You didn't say anything." "It's her business." Carol tilted her head. "There's something going on with her company, they're saying. Online, I mean. My niece texted me about it, some kind of controversy. He went home and opened his laptop. It took about 10 minutes of reading to understand what Carol meant by controversy. The coverage was everywhere: tech blogs, financial news, a few mainstream outlets. The headline framing varied, but the substance was consistent. Vivian Sterling was facing a coordinated campaign of negative press, questions about her company's latest product launch, rumors of internal dissatisfaction, a possible mass exodus of executives, anonymous sources claiming financial irregularities that, when Logan dug into the specific claims, didn't quite add up. The stories had a manufactured quality, like they'd been written to a template. He read until midnight. Then he closed the laptop and sat in his kitchen and thought about the dark sedan 2 blocks down. He didn't say anything to Vivian about the research. It wasn't his place. What he did instead was what he'd always done. He paid attention. He was on his porch a lot that week. He drove the long way around the block a few times, not conspicuously, just noticing. What he noticed was the sedan changed cars every day or two. There was a photographer who'd set up on the corner across from the mansion's gate with a long lens. And there was a van that appeared on Tuesday that had no logo on its side and was parked at a different angle than a car waiting for someone would normally be parked. On Friday, Emma brought it up first. They were walking back from the bus stop, and Emma stopped on the sidewalk, looking at the photographer on the corner. "Why is that man taking pictures of the house?" she asked. "He's not supposed to be there," Logan said. Emma looked at him. "Is Vivian in trouble?" "Where did you—" "I heard you and Carol talking," Emma said, without apology. "When you were on your porch and Carol was in her yard." She paused. "Adults don't look around enough when they think kids are too far away to hear." He crouched down so they were at eye level on the sidewalk. "I'm not sure what's going on," he said, which was as honest as he could be. "But I'm paying attention, okay?" Emma looked at him with her serious dark eyes. She had Rachel's eyes, the one inheritance that made him catch his breath sometimes, and said, "Should we check on her?" "I'll check on her," he said. "You go inside." Bob. She came to the gate herself when he rang the intercom, which he'd started to learn was what she did when she wasn't expecting a threat. She answered herself. When she was on alert, it was one of the staff. The composed exterior was intact, but there were shadows under her eyes that hadn't been there a week ago. She was wearing the same dark slacks she always wore, but her posture had a rigidity that was different from her usual controlled bearing. This was tension rather than discipline. "You look like you haven't slept," Logan said. "I'm fine." "You look like you've been managing something for a while without telling anyone about it." She looked at him. "I have a team." "I'm sure you do." He leaned against the gatepost. "The car that changed 4 times last week, the photographer on the corner, the van on Tuesday that wasn't a utility van." He kept his voice even, matter of fact. "I pay attention to things out of place. It's part of the job." Something moved in her expression. Not surprise exactly, more like the look of someone who'd expected to be alone in something and has just realized they're not. "It's a business matter," she said. "What kind of business matter involves a photographer camped on a residential street with a 2000mm lens?" She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Will you come inside?" He came inside. They sat in the front room of the mansion, which Vivian had furnished with the practical elegance of someone who had money but had not been born with it. There was nothing showy or excessive, just good pieces chosen with care. There was a large desk near the window with a laptop and papers spread across it, which told him she'd been working out here rather than an office in the house, because she wanted to see the street. She told him the outline of it, clearly and without embellishment. A competitor, she used the word carefully, like it didn't fully capture what she meant, had been running a coordinated disinformation campaign against Sterling Nexus for approximately 6 weeks. It had started with anonymous sourcing in trade publications, moved into financial speculation, and in the past 2 weeks had escalated into physical surveillance and what appeared to be attempts to identify and contact members of her core executive team. "The goal," she said, "is to destabilize investor confidence enough that the board considers a forced restructuring, which would clear the path for an acquisition." "An acquisition of your company?" "Yes." "By the competitor?" "Yes." Logan sat with this for a moment. "Who knows you're here?" At this address? My legal team, my COO, 2 board members. She paused. And apparently someone I didn't tell. Yeah, he said. Someone found you. She nodded once. Her hands, folded in her lap, were still, but he could see the tension in her forearms. What are you doing about it? He asked. My legal team is building a case. We're gathering documentation. It takes time to assemble something that will hold in. That's not what I'm asking. He leaned forward slightly. What are you doing tonight? Tomorrow? While that's happening. She looked at him with the direct, evaluative look that he'd gotten used to over the weeks. Why are you asking? Because you bought a house in a residential neighborhood, he said, and the people who want to hurt you know where it is, and you've got staff with earpieces, but you're sitting here alone in the front room watching the street, which tells me you're scared. The word landed. He saw it land. For a fraction of a second, before the composure sealed over again, he saw it. I'm not, she started. You don't have to say it, he said. I'm not asking you to say it. He stood up. I'm asking if you need help. She looked up at him from her chair. The light from the window caught the shadows under her eyes, the particular exhaustion of someone who had been managing a crisis alone and hadn't let themselves acknowledge how heavy it was. What kind of help could you possibly... I can watch for cars, he said. I know this street better than your security team does. I've been here 4 years. He shrugged because he didn't want to oversell it. And if something happens, you shouldn't be alone. The silence stretched between them. Outside, through the window, a car passed slowly. They both looked. It was just a car. Logan, she said. Yeah. I don't know how to... She stopped. Tried again. I'm not good at accepting help. I got that impression. It makes me feel, another stop. Vivienne, he said her name the way he'd started saying it recently, without thinking about it, just the way you say someone's name when you've gotten used to having them around. You can just say thank you. Another long pause, then, thank you. He nodded. Okay. I'm going to go make sure Emma's eaten dinner, but I'm going to be on my porch tonight, and I'll be paying attention. He walked to the door. He'd almost reached it when she spoke again, and her voice was quieter than he'd heard it. And for the first time since she'd moved in, he heard something in it that wasn't controlled. She was right, you know, Vivienne said. Emma, what she said about you. He looked back. That you're good at a lot of things, she said. She's right. He held her gaze for a moment, then he said, Good night, Vivienne. Good night, Logan. He went home to his daughter and his small house and his porch, and he sat outside in the cooling air for a long time, watching the street and thinking about a woman who had built a billion-dollar empire and still managed to look, in certain lights, exactly like someone who needed someone to stay close to the fence. He was very careful not to think about what that meant, but he was already thinking about it. He just hadn't admitted it yet. He kept his word. For the next 2 weeks, Logan was on his porch most evenings. Not conspicuously, not in any way that would have looked to a casual observer like surveillance. He worked. He had boards to sand, trim to paint, a section of railing that needed replacing. He had the kind of work that a man could do slowly in the evening light, with a beer on the step beside him, while watching a street with the unhurried attention of someone who had nothing particular to watch for. Except he did have something to watch for, and he watched for it. The dark sedan came back on a Wednesday. Different car, same angle, same half-block distance from the mansion gate. Logan noted the plate number in his phone, a habit that surprised him, that he'd done it at all, that his hands had moved to the phone before he'd consciously decided to document anything. He texted the number to Vivienne without explanation. 3 minutes later, she texted back. Already flagged. They switched plates yesterday. Same vehicle. He typed, How do you know it's the same one? A pause. Then, dent in the rear quarter panel, driver's side. My security team photographed it 2 days ago. He looked down the block at the car. He couldn't see the dent from here, but he believed her. Your team is better than I thought, he wrote. They're very good, she replied. The problem isn't their competence. The problem is that I can't prove who's paying for the car. He thought about that. Then he typed, I know someone who can. Another pause, longer this time. Who? Former Army guy I worked with on a build last year. He does private investigations now, mostly insurance fraud, but he's good at tracing paper. Logan. Yeah, you don't have to. I know I don't have to. He looked at the car again. You want the number or not? The pause this time was the longest. He could almost feel her deciding something on the other end of it, whatever the internal calculation was that she ran before accepting help, the one that seemed to take her longer than most things. Yes, she finally wrote. Thank you. He sent the number. He went back to sanding. The car left at 9:43 and didn't come back that night. What was harder to account for than the surveillance was what was happening inside the fence. Emma had taken full possession of Vivian's garden in the way that children take possession of things, completely, without asking, with the assumption that the invitation once given was a permanent and open one. She had assigned herself the role of co-caretaker of the bulb she'd planted, which had since pushed a small green shoot above the soil surface, and she reported on its progress to Logan every evening with the seriousness of a scientist monitoring an experiment. It grew 4 millimeters since yesterday, she said one Thursday over dinner. Vivian measured it. Logan looked up from his plate. When did Vivian measure it? When I went over after school. He set down his fork. Em, you can't just go over there without asking. Emma looked at him with the calm confidence of someone who has already run the argument and knows how it ends. I rang the intercom. That's not the same as asking me first. You would have said yes. That's not... He stopped. He ran his hand over his face. You can't assume. You need to ask. That's the rule. Emma ate a piece of broccoli without committing to whether she agreed. She seemed happy I came, she said. She was working in her office and she came out when I rang, and she smiled, a real smile. She said this with the authority of someone who had become an expert in Vivian's smiles, which Logan suspected she had. She doesn't do that, the other kind of smile, very often. What other kind? Emma considered how to describe it. The kind that's for the outside, like when people come to her gate and she looks like she's smiling but her eyes aren't doing anything. Logan was quiet for a moment. You notice a lot. You taught me to look at things carefully. He had taught her that. He'd been teaching her that since she was small enough to carry on his shoulders. Look at how something is built. Look at where the joints are. Look at what's holding the weight. He'd meant construction. She'd applied it to everything. Still ask me first, he said. Okay, she said, which meant she'd probably ask, most of the time. After dinner, while Emma was doing homework at the kitchen table, Logan stood at the sink washing dishes and thought about what she'd said about the real smile. He'd seen it a few times himself over the past weeks. Not often, but enough to know what Emma meant. The difference between the composed, functional expression Vivian wore for most of the world and the thing that occasionally broke through when she wasn't managing her face, usually when she was in the garden, sometimes when Emma said something that caught her off guard. He'd been trying to be careful about noticing that. He wasn't sure he was succeeding. Tiala, the evening that shifted things, not dramatically, not with a single moment that either of them would have been able to point to and say there, that's when it changed, was a Thursday night in late October when the temperature had dropped fast and Logan had built a fire in his backyard fire pit because Emma had been asking about it for 2 weeks and he kept saying soon and he'd decided tonight was soon. They were sitting around the fire, Emma wrapped in a blanket, holding a stick with a marshmallow on it, watching it with the focused intensity of someone managing a very high-stakes operation, when Logan heard the side gate that backed onto the fence line creak. He looked up. Vivian was standing at the gap in the boards that Emma's soccer ball had made weeks ago. The boards still hadn't been fixed because every time Logan thought about fixing them, he found he hadn't gotten around to it. He'd been finding that a lot recently. She was wearing a jacket that wasn't warm enough for the night and holding nothing in particular, and she looked for a moment uncertain in a way he'd never seen her look before, like she'd done something on impulse and was now having second thoughts about it. Sorry, she said. I saw the fire from the upstairs window and I'll go. You don't have to go, Emma said immediately, because Emma had no second thoughts about anything. She was still watching the marshmallow. We have extra sticks. Vivian looked at Logan. Come on, he said. We have blankets. She came through the gap in the fence. She sat in the empty camp chair beside Logan, so Emma was on a log on the other side of the fire, and she tucked her hands between her knees against the cold, and Logan got up without saying anything and went inside and came back with one of the old fleece blankets he kept in the closet and put it on the arm of her chair. Thank you, she said quietly. Marshmallow? He asked. I've never had one. Emma's head snapped up from the fire. You've never had a s'more? I didn't have the kind of childhood that had a lot of campfires in it, Vivian said. Emma stared at her with the particular horror of a 7-year-old confronting a gap in someone else's experience that she finds deeply unjust. Okay, she said with great seriousness. We're fixing this right now. What followed was a 15-minute tutorial that Emma delivered with the gravity of an expert in a subject she'd known about for approximately 2 years, during which Vivian patiently held a stick over the fire, burned her first marshmallow to carbon, started over, and eventually produced a marshmallow that Emma deemed acceptable. You have to be patient, Emma told her. You want to turn it slow. I'm not very good at slow, Vivian said. I know, Emma said. I can tell. You always move like you're going somewhere important. Vivian looked down at her marshmallow, turning it carefully. Maybe I'm working on that. Logan watched the fire and said nothing. They stayed out there for almost 2 hours. Emma fell asleep in the camp chair around 8:30, the blanket pulled up to her chin, the way she could fall asleep anywhere when she'd been running at full capacity all day. Logan carried her inside and put her to bed, and when he came back out, he half expected the camp chair to be empty. Vivian was still there, sitting with her hands wrapped around a mug of coffee he'd left on the arm of her chair before he went in, looking into the fire. He sat back down. They were quiet for a while in the way that people are quiet when the silence is comfortable, which was something Logan hadn't expected, that he'd be comfortable being quiet around her because she'd seemed initially like someone who required management, whose presence had a weight to it that demanded attention and navigation. And she did have that quality. But she also had this other thing, this capacity for stillness that he'd noticed in the garden and was noticing again now, the way she could just be somewhere without needing to fill the space. Can I ask you something? He said. You can ask. Why here? This neighborhood. You could have bought anywhere. She looked at the fire for a moment before she answered. My security team wanted me in a high-rise, private elevator, controlled access, the whole thing. She paused. I tried that for a year after we hit the second billion. There was an apartment in the city. It had every security feature you can imagine. She stopped again, and the way she stopped was the way she stopped when she was being accurate rather than just informative. I was the safest I'd ever been in my life, and I hated every single morning I woke up there. Why? Because it felt like a vault, she said. Beautiful, secure, perfectly climate-controlled, and completely sealed. She turned the mug in her hands. I wanted a neighborhood. I wanted to hear people walking dogs. She looked at the gap in the fence. I wanted a fence with a gap in it, apparently. Logan was quiet. Then, did you expect it to be like this? No, she said honestly. I expected to be alone in a bigger house. I didn't expect... She gestured, a small motion that seemed to take in the fire and the chairs and the empty camp chair where Emma had been sleeping. He looked at the fire. He could feel the specific weight of the moment, the way it was tipping toward something, the way you could feel a structure shifting before it actually moved. He'd learned to read that in buildings. He was learning to read it in this. I need to tell you something, he said. She looked at him. I looked you up, he said, the night you moved in. I want you to know that I've known who you are since before Emma kicked the ball over the fence. She was quiet for a moment. Why are you telling me that? Because you should know, he said. I don't want to. I don't want there to be something you don't know about, something I knew that you didn't know I knew. It bothers me. She studied him with the look he'd gotten used to, the evaluative one, the one she ran when she was trying to place him. Most people, she said slowly, when they figure out who I am, they either treat me like a contact to be cultivated or they get weird and deferential. You did neither. You're a person, he said. Complicated, clearly, but a person. She looked at him for a long moment. You're a strange man, Logan Pierce. You're not the first person to say that. I mean it as a compliment. I know, he said. I took it as one. She turned back to the fire. He turned back to the fire. And they sat there in the reasonable comfort of two people who had admitted something true to each other and found that the truth didn't break anything until the fire burned down to coals and the cold came up too heavy to ignore. The news broke on a Tuesday. Logan found out from Carol, which was how he found out about most things in the neighborhood, but this time Carol came to his door at 7 in the morning looking genuinely distressed, which was unusual for Carol, who was the kind of woman who processed distress by organizing things. There are 4 news vans now, she said, on Melrose and on the Avenue. And there's something on the internet. He already had his phone out. He'd gotten an alert at 6:50 that he hadn't opened yet. The story was on 2 major financial news sites and 3 tech blogs. The headline on the most prominent one read, Sterling Nexus faces insider trading claims as executives prepare to jump ship. The sourcing was anonymous. The claims were detailed enough to sound credible and vague enough to be impossible to immediately disprove. The specific combination that Logan had learned from reading the earlier coverage was the signature of a coordinated leak. He called Vivienne. She picked up on the first ring, which meant she'd been awake. I saw it, she said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath the control. Not panic, not fear exactly, but the particular tightness of someone who is holding something very heavy. Is any of it true? A pause, and he registered the pause with a complicated feeling. Not suspicion, but the awareness that he'd asked something that required trust to answer. No, she said. None of it is true. But that's not how this works. True doesn't matter as much as plausible, and these people know how to make things plausible. Your legal team is already on it. I have a call in 20 minutes. He heard something in the background, Papers, movement. Logan, I need to ask you something. Ask. The man you mentioned, the investigator, has he made any progress on the car registration? He had, in fact. Logan had gotten a text 2 days ago that he'd been sitting on, waiting to understand what it meant before he brought it to Vivienne, because half information was sometimes worse than none. He traced the registration through 2 shell companies, Logan said. He's still working on the 3rd layer. How much time does he need? He said a few more days. Vivienne was quiet. Tell him he has resources, whatever he needs. He won't take money from... Tell him anyway. Logan was at the window now, looking up the block. He could see the edge of one of the news vans from here, the satellite arm raised against the morning sky. How bad is this going to get? Another pause. Longer. I don't know, she said, and that honesty, the admission that she didn't know, cost her something. He could hear it cost her. The board has an emergency call this afternoon. Some of the members are... She stopped. There are people who will use this as an excuse to do what they've been wanting to do for a while. Which is what? Reduce my control. Force a restructuring vote. It would open the door for... She stopped again. It doesn't matter the details. What matters is that someone planned this carefully, and the timing is not an accident. I know, he said. You know. The insider trading story lands 2 days before the board call, Logan said. That's not coincidence. A silence. How do you know about the board call? You mentioned it 3 weeks ago. I was paying attention. She was quiet for a moment on the other end. When she spoke again, her voice was different. Not softer exactly, but less armored. I keep underestimating you. You keep trying to figure out what category I fit in, he said. Maybe I don't fit in one. Maybe you don't, she said. He heard something on her end that sounded like a notification. Urgent, multiple. Her 20-minute window was probably down to 15. Go take your call, he said. Emma's going to come over after school if that's okay. It's always okay. And Vivienne. Yes. Stop looking at the news coverage. It's designed to make you feel like it's already over. It isn't. A long pause. Then, okay. He hung up. He looked at the van up the block. He thought about the third shell company, the paper trail his investigator friend was following through whatever corporate labyrinth someone had constructed, and about the fact that the timing of the board call wasn't a coincidence, and about a $10 billion company that someone wanted badly enough to orchestrate all of this to get. He also thought about Vivian's voice in those last 2 minutes of the call. Not the CEO voice, not the controlled and managing voice, the other voice, the one that cost something. He got Emma up and made breakfast and took her to the bus stop, and came back and called his investigator contact and said, "She'll cover whatever you need for the third layer. Don't argue about it." And then he went to work because he still had a job and the job still had to get done. The paparazzi photographer moved from the corner to a position directly across from the gate about 10 days after the news broke, which represented a territorial escalation that Logan noted without reacting to. There was now a small constellation of media presence around the block, not overwhelming, not the full-scale circus that gathered around genuinely famous people in crisis, but enough to make the neighborhood feel different. Watched. Some of his neighbors left quickly from their driveways, heads down. Carol had taken to parking around the corner. Emma noticed all of it, in the way she noticed things, quietly and thoroughly. She didn't say anything about it directly for almost a week. Then one afternoon, walking home from the bus stop, she asked, "Why do people want to take her picture if she doesn't want them to?" "Because she's famous," Logan said. "And when something's happening with someone famous, people want to watch. But it makes her uncomfortable." "I know." "How does that feel for her?" He looked down at Emma. "Probably like being watched all the time without being able to stop it." "That sounds awful." "It is awful." Emma was quiet for half a block. "Is it going to stop?" "I think so," he said. "Not immediately, but eventually." "Are you going to make it stop?" "I'm helping," he said carefully. "But I'm not the one who fixes this. She's the one who fixes this. You're just staying close," Emma said, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone who has observed something and is simply naming it. He looked at her. She looked back, not with any particular implication, just the clear, direct look of a 7-year-old who has noticed a thing and named it and is waiting to see if the adult will confirm or deny. "Yeah," he said, "I'm staying close." Emma nodded as if this made complete sense and moved on to telling him about something that had happened at school. And Logan walked beside her and listened, and thought about what it meant that his daughter had named it before he'd fully said it to himself. The night the first threat appeared at the gate, Logan was awake because Emma had a cold and was sleeping badly, cycling between sleep and waking every 40 minutes. And he'd been lying awake between her check-ins, staring at the ceiling in the way you do when sleep feels like a country that's revoked your visa. He got up at 2 in the morning to get her another glass of water and stood at the kitchen window in the dark. And he saw the light. Just for a second, a flashlight beam on the other side of the fence, sweeping low across the ground in Vivian's garden. He was outside in 30 seconds, no shoes, the yard cold and wet under his feet. He grabbed the flashlight he kept by the back door and went to the gap in the fence and looked through. There was no one visible in the garden. The beam was gone. But there was something on the gatepost. He could see it from this angle, something pale against the dark iron, something that hadn't been there yesterday. He went back inside. He texted Vivian, "Gatepost, right side. Look in the morning before your team moves anything." He waited. At 2:14, she replied, "Already saw it. We're documenting it now." "What was it?" A pause. Then, a note, with my home address on it and a description of Emma. He stared at the screen for a long time. The cold from the kitchen floor moved up through his feet into his legs, and he barely felt it. A description of Emma. He went and checked the locks on every door and window in the house, systematically, room by room, the way he'd never done before. Not because he'd thought the house was unsafe, but because he'd never had a reason to do it at 2 in the morning with the kind of focused certainty that left no room for anything else. Then he went and stood in the doorway of Emma's room and watched her sleep for a few minutes, her breathing rough with the cold, her hair spread out on the pillow, entirely peaceful and entirely unaware. He texted Vivian again. "We need to talk tomorrow, not through the fence." She replied immediately, "I know. I'm sorry, Logan." He typed back, Don't apologize. Just let me in when I knock. He went back to bed. He didn't sleep. By morning, he had understood something that he'd been moving toward for weeks without quite letting himself land on it. That whatever this was, whatever line he'd been carefully standing on the right side of since the 17 trucks had arrived, he'd already crossed it without noticing, and the note with Emma's description on it was not the moment of crossing. It was just the moment he'd acknowledged it. He was involved, not as a neighbor, not as someone doing a reasonable favor for the person next door. He was involved the way you're involved in things that actually matter, which is the way that doesn't have a clean exit strategy, and doesn't have an official capacity, and doesn't come with instructions. He made Emma breakfast. He packed her lunch, turkey and Swiss, crusts off, pretzels, juice box. He drove her to school instead of the bus because the bus stop was a block and a half away and visible from the corner where the photographer had been. And this morning he didn't want Emma visible anywhere she didn't have to be. He watched her walk through the school doors. He sat in the truck for a moment with both hands on the steering wheel. Then he drove back to the neighborhood and knocked on Vivian's gate. Vivian answered the gate before he finished knocking. She'd been awake. That was obvious, say, not from how she looked, because she had the particular discipline of someone who could compose herself even on 3 hours of sleep, but from the speed of it. She'd been standing somewhere close to the gate, waiting, which told him more than she probably wanted it to. He came inside. They sat at the kitchen table rather than the front room. The kitchen felt more honest, less like a meeting, and he thought she'd chosen it for exactly that reason. There was coffee already made. She poured 2 cups without asking and set one in front of him and wrapped both hands around hers like she needed the heat. "Talk to me," he said. She set the mug down. "The note is the 4th escalation in 8 days. My security team has documented all of it. Photographs, timestamps, chain of custody. We have enough for a restraining order against persons unknown, which is essentially useless." She said it without bitterness, just flatly, the way you describe a tool that isn't the right size for the job. "The problem is we can't get a restraining order against a corporation, and right now I can't prove it's a corporation." "But you know it is." "I know who it is," she said. "I've known for 3 weeks. What I don't have is the documented connection between Marcus Hale and the people showing up outside my gate." She paused. "Marcus Hale is the CEO of Vertex Systems," Logan said. "I know. I've been reading." She looked at him. "How deep have you gone?" "Deep enough to know that Vertex has been trying to acquire Sterling Nexus for 2 years, and you've turned them down twice. And that the last time you turned them down, Marcus Hale reportedly said in a private dinner that he had other options." He picked up his coffee. "I know someone who was at that dinner and mentioned it to someone who mentioned it online, which is how it ended up in a forum thread that I probably spent too much time on at 1 in the morning. Vivian stared at him for a moment. "You did research. I told you I pay attention to things." "There's a difference between paying attention and spending your nights in forum threads about corporate acquisitions." "Yeah," he said. "I crossed that line a couple weeks ago." He said it without apology, but he watched her face when he said it, the way she took it in, the slight recalibration that happened in her expression. "Is the board call still scheduled for Thursday?" "Yes." "And Hale knows that." "He absolutely knows that." She picked up her mug again. The insider trading story, the executive exodus narrative, and now physical escalation. It's a sequence. He's trying to create enough noise that the board members who are already uncomfortable with how I run the company will vote for a restructuring as the path of least resistance. Would they actually do that? She was quiet for a moment. 2 of them would vote that way regardless. 2 of them will hold. The other 3 are in play. It depends on what's in front of them on Thursday. What's in front of them now? A company with declining stock price, an insider trading allegation we haven't been able to fully counter publicly yet, and a CEO who is apparently hiding in a residential neighborhood because her primary residence became unsafe. She said it in the same flat, accurate tone, but he heard what was underneath it. Not self-pity, something more complicated than that. The particular exhaustion of someone who had built a thing and was watching it be used against her. "You're not hiding," he said. "Functionally, I am." "You're working from a different location. There's a difference." He turned his mug on the table. "What does your legal team need to move faster?" documentation of the direct link, something that puts Hale or a Hale associate at the source of the campaign. Right now, everything we have shows the effects, the stories, the surveillance, the notes, but the trail goes cold at the second or third degree of separation. She looked at him. Your investigator friend, the third shell company. He texted me this morning, Logan said. He's through the third layer. There's a fourth. Vivian closed her eyes briefly. Of course there is. He said the structure is deliberate, built to take time to unwrap, but he said something else. Logan leaned forward slightly. He said the fourth layer has a registered agent that he's seen before, on a different case, and the name attached to that agent connects to a Vertex subsidiary. She opened her eyes. She looked at him with absolute stillness. Say that again? It's not clean yet. He said it's a thread, not a rope, but it's a thread that leads somewhere specific. How long? He said 48 hours if nothing blocks him. What would block him? Someone noticing he's looking. Vivian was quiet for a moment. Then she got up and went to the counter and stood there with her back to him, and he waited because he'd learned that she processed things in motion sometimes. She needed to move away from the table when the information was large. If he finds the connection, she said without turning around, and if it holds, and if my legal team can verify it independently, we'd have enough to go to the board Thursday with a counter-narrative, not just defense, offense. That's what I understood, Logan said. She turned around. Her face was not composed exactly, not in the managed way. Something more real than that, something that the situation had cracked open a little. Why are you doing this? She said. Doing what? This. She gestured a motion that seemed to mean all of it. The research, the investigator, the 2 a.m. texts, the driving Emma to school. You have a life. You have a job and a daughter and a porch that still needs work. And you have spent the last month. She stopped. I don't understand what's in this for you. He looked at her for a long moment. He could have said the easy thing. You're my neighbor. It's the right thing to do. I'd do it for anyone. He thought about saying it. He thought about the clean exit it would give both of them, the way it would put everything back in a box with a label on it. You know what's in it, he said instead. The silence was long, and neither of them broke it quickly. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere outside he could hear a car on the street, probably a news van, probably nothing, but they both heard it and neither of them looked toward the window. Logan, she started, you don't have to say anything about it right now, he said. We've got a board call on Thursday and a 48-hour window, and someone who put my daughter's description on a note. We can deal with the other thing later. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she nodded once, and he saw the relief in it. Not the relief of avoiding something, but the relief of a person who'd been given permission to focus on what was survivable right now. Okay, she said. Later. He finished his coffee and went home to wait. The storm came on Wednesday night. It had been building all day. The flat, yellowish light of a sky that couldn't decide what it wanted to do. The kind of pressure change that made dogs anxious and old injuries ache. By 8 o'clock, the wind was moving through the neighborhood in sustained gusts that rattled the windows in Logan's house and sent the last of the autumn leaves off the trees in horizontal sheets. Emma had fallen asleep early for once, her cold almost fully gone, knocked out by the combination of children's medicine and the particular exhaustion of a kid who'd been fighting off illness for days. Logan had been sitting at the kitchen table with his laptop open, going back over everything his investigator contact had sent. The shell company documents, the registered agent records, the subsidiary connection, trying to understand it well enough to be useful rather than just informed. He heard the rain start at 9:40, heavy and immediate, no gradual buildup. At 10:15 he heard something else. It was hard to identify at first, a sound that didn't fit the storm's patterns, not the creak of the house or the gutters or the wind through the gap in the back fence boards. He'd replaced most of those boards finally, but there was still one section on the far side that was newer wood, that moved differently in wind, and he knew the sound of it. This was different. It was a sound that belonged to something deliberate. He was at the back door in seconds, the flashlight from the hook, shoes he'd pulled on without sitting down. The rain hit him immediately and hard. He crossed the yard with the light aimed low and looked through the fence. There were two of them. They were at the back of Vivian's garden, moving toward the house along the gravel path that ran beside the rose beds. They were dressed for the rain, dark jackets, hoods up, and they were moving with the careful efficiency of people who had thought through what they were doing. One of them had a bag. The other had something in his hand that Logan's eyes took a second to process. A bolt cutter. They were heading for the back service entrance of the mansion, a heavy wooden door set into the garden wall that Logan had noticed but never seen open, that presumably connected to a utility area or the basement, the kind of door that a security system might not prioritize. He had about 4 seconds to make a decision. He made it without thinking very much, which was how he made most decisions in emergencies, which was a quality he'd had since he was a kid and had never entirely figured out whether it was a strength or a recklessness. "Hey," he said. Not a shout. Firm, flat, loud enough to carry over the rain. The voice of a man on a job site stopping something before it gets worse. Both figures stopped. They turned. Logan had the flashlight on them. He was aware, in the particular split-second awareness of a high adrenaline moment, of several things simultaneously, that he had nothing in his hand except a flashlight, that there were two of them, that the one with the bolt cutter was larger than the other one, and that the bolt cutter was a tool and not a weapon, but could be used as either. He was also aware that he was in someone else's yard in a rainstorm at 10:15 at night, and that this was going to be difficult to explain if it went wrong. "This is private property," he said. Same voice, same flat authority. "Security's been notified." This was partially true. He'd already texted Vivian's head of security. Marcus, a former federal agent whose last name Logan didn't know, but who had given Logan his direct number 3 weeks ago with the specific instruction to use it if he saw anything from next door. He'd texted it the moment he'd come through the fence. He did not know if Marcus had seen it yet. The two figures looked at each other. A calculation happened between them that Logan couldn't hear but could see. The slight shift of weight, the angle of the head, the assessment. The larger one with the bolt cutter took a step forward. Logan held his ground. His heart was doing something complicated, but his feet weren't moving, and he'd found over the years that the feet mattered more than the heart in these moments. "I've been out here for 3 minutes," he said. "Cameras have you from 2 angles. You want to make this a bigger problem than it already is?" There were no cameras on this specific corner of the garden. He didn't know if they knew that. He was betting they didn't, and that the bolt cutter was for the door and not for him, and that people who were paid to do a quiet job didn't want the job to become loud. The bet held. After a moment that lasted longer than it should have, the larger man stepped back. They looked at each other again. Then they moved, not running, but quickly, back along the path toward the far wall of the garden. Logan tracked them with the flashlight until they were over the wall and gone. He stood in the rain for a moment, alone, heart going. Then the back door of the mansion opened, and Vivian was there in the light of the doorway, and behind her was Marcus, who was on a phone and moving toward Logan with the controlled urgency of someone already managing multiple things at once. "You're bleeding," Vivian said. He looked down. His forearm, he hadn't noticed, but in the scramble through the fence he'd caught the edge of a board, and there was a cut along the outside of his arm that was more significant than he'd thought. The rain was diluting it, making it look like more than it was, probably. "I'm fine," he said. "You're bleeding," she said again, more firmly, which was Vivian's version of, "You are not fine." Marcus was already on the perimeter, moving fast. There were 2 other members of the security team Logan hadn't met materializing from somewhere. They'd come through the side gate and were sweeping the garden. He stepped back and let them work, because they knew what they were doing and he didn't, and standing in the middle of it was just going to slow things down. Vivian steered him inside. The kitchen of the mansion was large and lit brightly and warm in a way that felt disorienting after the dark and rain. She sat him at the kitchen island and disappeared and came back with a first aid kit, a real one, not a drugstore box, the kind with proper supplies, which he noted without surprise because of course she had a real first aid kit. She set it on the counter and opened it and looked at his arm. "This needs to be cleaned," she said. "I know. Hold still." She cleaned the cut with the focused efficiency of someone who had learned how to do it correctly and didn't want to waste time. Her hands were steady. He watched her hands because it was easier than watching her face, which was different than he'd seen it. The composure was intact, but something underneath it was not. And the not was something he was trying not to look at directly, because looking at it directly felt like more than he was ready for right now. "What were they doing?" she said, without looking up from his arm. "Heading for the service door. One of them had a bolt cutter." "The service door is the one weak point in the exterior," she said. "I told Marcus about it 2 weeks ago." She didn't say what she thought about that, but her hands tightened very slightly on the gauze she was pressing to his arm. "They'd done reconnaissance." "Yes." "They knew where to go." "Yes." She taped the gauze down and stepped back. She was looking at him now. The full direct look, not the evaluative one, something more exposed than that. The rain was still coming down heavily outside the windows. "You could have been hurt," she said. "I'm not hurt." "You are, in fact, demonstrably. It's a scratch, Vivian." "Logan." She said his name the way he'd started saying hers, not with any particular instruction attached to it, just the name itself, which was a thing people did when the name was the whole of what they meant. "I wasn't going to stand in my yard and watch," he said. "They could have had—" "I know what they could have had." He met her eyes. "I made a call. It worked out. This time?" "Yeah, this time." She turned and put the first aid kit back together, which he recognized as her doing something with her hands, because she needed to do something with her hands. He sat on the bar stool at the island and let his heartbeat come down and watched her move around the kitchen. "I need to call my legal team," she said. "I know. Marcus will have footage from the street cameras and the front system. If they got even partial identification, that's what you need to focus on," he said. "Make your calls. I'll stay until Marcus tells me the perimeter's clear." She stopped at the counter. She was facing away from him, and he could see the line of her shoulders, the tension in them, the particular way she held herself when she was managing something internal and not letting it show. He'd gotten good at reading that particular posture. "You called Marcus before you went through the fence," she said. "Yes." "Before you even knew what you were going to find?" "Yes." She turned around. Her face had the quality of someone who'd been alone in something for a long time and had just, very unexpectedly, found that they weren't. It was not a comfortable expression. It was the expression of someone being cracked open in a way they hadn't authorized. "Why didn't you wake me first?" she said. "Because there wasn't time." He paused. "And because you would have come out there." "Yes," she said. "I would have." "I know." He looked at her steadily. "That's why I didn't." Something moved across her face, too complicated to name, and he didn't try to name it. She looked at him for a long moment, and then Marcus came back through the kitchen door and reported that the perimeter was clear, that they had partial footage from the street system, and that the police had been notified and were sending a unit. The next hour was logistics, statements, documentation, a conversation between Vivian and her head of security that Logan sat in on, because no one told him to leave and he didn't feel like leaving. At midnight, Marcus confirmed the footage had captured a clear image of the second man's face, the one without the bolt cutter, who had turned into the flashlight beam for a half second. Vivian's legal team was working by 12:30. By 1 in the morning, the police unit had come and gone. The mansion was quiet again. Logan was still at the kitchen island with a second cup of coffee he hadn't finished, and Vivian was on a call in the next room that had been going for 20 minutes, and he could hear the cadence of her voice without the words, controlled, precise, giving information rather than receiving it. She came back into the kitchen and sat down across from him. "The man in the footage," she said. "My team identified him in 20 minutes. She paused. "He's a former Vertex Systems security contractor. Laid off 8 months ago, but he's done work for Vertex-adjacent organizations since." Logan looked at her. "That's the thread." "That's the thread," she said. "It doesn't prove Hale ordered tonight specifically, but combined with what your investigator found, the shell company, the registered agent, it's a chain. It's not complete, but it's close enough that my legal team thinks we can present it Thursday in a way that changes the conversation." "From defense to offense," he said. "Yes." She looked at her coffee. "Logan, if we hadn't had—" She stopped, started again. "If you hadn't been watching and hadn't documented the car early on, and hadn't asked your contact to trace the registration, you would have found it another way. Maybe, but not by Thursday. He didn't say anything to that. He finished his coffee. The rain outside had eased from heavy to steady, the kind that would last until morning. I need to tell you something, Vivian said. He waited. I've been drafting a plan, she said, to leave, after Thursday, regardless of how Thursday goes. I was going to come to you and Emma and tell you that I needed to go back to the city, that it wasn't safe to stay here, that me being next door was putting you both at... Vivian. I was going to say that the note with Emma's description changed things, that I wasn't willing to... Vivian. She stopped. Don't, he said. Logan, there was a description of Emma on a piece of paper taped to my gate. These people know she exists. They know she comes to my property. If me leaving keeps her... If you leave, he said carefully, they've won the quiet part, the personal part. He leaned forward slightly. You move into a high-rise, you go back behind the controlled perimeter, and whoever did this gets to know that they could do it, that it worked. I don't care about that. Not for myself. Her voice was steady, but he heard the thing underneath it, the thing that had been building for weeks, that Emma had identified in the garden on the first day. Emma is 7 years old, and she stopped. Her jaw was tight. She matters more than... She does matter, he said. She matters more than anything, which is exactly why you running isn't the answer. He looked at her directly. You think leaving makes her safer. I think you're wrong. I think these people will use whatever they can find, and Emma is only a useful point of pressure as long as they think she can move you. The moment this is over, the moment you walk into that board meeting Thursday with what you have, she stops being useful to them. The silence was long. Vivian looked at the table, then at the window where the rain was running down the glass in thin silver lines. You sound very certain, she said. I'm not certain, he said. I'm almost never certain. But I think it's right. She looked at him. He looked back. And somewhere in the sustained quiet of that kitchen at 1 a.m, with the rain against the glass and the security team running checks on the perimeter, the thing that had been building between them for 8 weeks and hadn't been named, was present in the room as clearly as if someone had said it aloud. Neither of them said it. They weren't there yet, or they were somewhere between not there and there, in the unnamed country he'd been standing in for a while. I'll stay through Thursday, she said. Good. If Thursday goes badly, we'll deal with Thursday going badly on Friday, he said. She almost smiled. The almost was enough. Okay. He stood up. He needed to go check on Emma, go back to his house, sleep for whatever hours remained before morning. You should try to rest, he said. I will. She stood too. She walked him to the back door. They stood at the threshold where the light from the kitchen met the dark of the garden, the rain still steady, the air smelling of wet earth and the roses that had closed themselves against the weather. Logan, she said. Yeah. She looked at him with the full weight of whatever it was that didn't have a name yet. Thank you, she said. I know I keep saying it. You can keep saying it, he said. I don't mind. He went out into the rain and across the garden and through the gap in the fence and into his yard, and he stood on his back porch for a moment looking at the light in her kitchen window, still on, still burning. Then he went inside. He had 3 hours of sleep before Emma was up. He made breakfast and drove her to school and came home and sat at the kitchen table with his phone, reading the thread of messages from his investigator contact who had, overnight, confirmed the fourth layer. The registered agent for the fourth shell company was a man named Gerald Soto. Gerald Soto had served on the board of a Vertex Systems subsidiary from 2019 to 2022. His signature appeared on 2 incorporation documents for companies that had, in the past 6 months, received payments from a routing account that also appeared in the first shell company's transaction records. It was a chain. It was not a simple chain, but it was a chain. He sent everything to Vivian. She replied in 3 minutes. My legal team has it. They're working. Then at noon, she called. The man from the footage, she said. Her voice had the particular quality it got when she was telling him something important. Stripped down, no management. His name is Derek Crane. He has a record. 2 counts of trespassing, 1 count of vandalism, all from the past 3 years. all associated with hostile corporate situations. A hired hand. A hired hand who got careless. My legal team contacted his former public defender this morning. She paused. He's willing to talk. In exchange for, he's going to flip. He's considering it. Another pause. If he talks, we have a direct line from tonight to whoever authorized tonight. And if that line connects to Hale, it will. You sound very certain again. Someone built 4 shell companies and hired ex-contractors and orchestrated 6 weeks of coordinated pressure, Logan said. That's not something you do casually. That's something you do when you want something badly enough to risk everything for it. The only person who wants Sterling Nexus that badly is Hale. Vivian was quiet for a moment. When she spoke again, her voice had shifted. Not softer, but different. The kind of difference that happened when something released, even slightly. The board meeting is at 9 Thursday morning. I know. Whatever happens. I'll be here, he said. Whatever happens. She hung up. He sat at the kitchen table and looked at the fence through the back window and thought about a woman who had built $10 billion out of nothing and was about to walk into the most important meeting of her professional life with a chain of evidence assembled partly by a freelance construction worker and a retired army guy who mostly did insurance fraud. He thought about the note on the gate post with Emma's description on it, and about the man with the bolt cutter in the rain, and about Vivian's hands on his arm and the steadiness of them. He thought about the gap in the fence and what it meant that neither of them had moved to close it. Then he went to the job site because the work wasn't going to do itself. And he worked with his hands and didn't think about Thursday, or tried not to for the rest of the afternoon. He was not very successful, but he tried. Wednesday night, Logan didn't sleep much. He told himself it was because of the board meeting, that his mind was running the chain of evidence the way he ran measurements on a job site, checking for gaps, making sure nothing was loose. That was part of it. But the honest part, the part he lay in the dark, acknowledging to the ceiling, was that he was thinking about what Vivian had said before she'd stopped herself. I've been drafting a plan. To leave. She'd been going to disappear, cleanly, probably. With a reasonable explanation, he might even have accepted if he hadn't already learned to read the difference between her managed voice and the other one. She'd been going to protect them by removing herself, and the fact that she'd thought of it that way, that her first instinct under pressure was to subtract herself from the equation, told him something about the specific shape of her loneliness that he hadn't been able to fully articulate before. He got up at 5, made coffee, sat at the kitchen table in the quiet house, and did not look at his phone. At 5:47, his phone lit up. Vivian. Derek Crane signed the cooperation agreement an hour ago. Legal team has his full statement. The chain connects. He stared at the screen for a moment. Then he typed, all the way to Hale? The reply came fast. All the way. He authorized the surveillance campaign, the media leaks, and Wednesday night. In writing, through a cutout, but Crane has the communications, screenshots, emails, a recorded call. Logan set the phone down. He picked up his coffee. He looked at the window where the morning was just beginning to gray the sky, and he sat with the specific feeling of a thing that had been teetering finally landing on solid ground. How are you? He typed. A longer pause this time, then, I don't know yet. Ask me after 9. He almost typed something else. He stopped himself. Okay, go get ready. You've got this. He didn't hear back, which meant she'd put the phone down and was doing what she needed to do, which was right. He made Emma breakfast, packed her lunch, and drove her to school. On the way back, he stopped at the gas station on the corner and stood outside his truck in the cold morning air, looking at nothing in particular, and thought about the word yet. How she'd used it. I don't know yet. The yet was interesting. It meant she expected to know eventually. It meant she was giving herself permission to land somewhere when the ground stopped moving. He went home and worked on the porch railing he'd been putting off, because the morning was clear and cold, and working with his hands was the only way he knew to wait without going crazy. She called it 11:14. He was in the middle of sanding a section of railing, and he had sawdust on his jacket and his hands, and he picked up anyway. It's done, she said. Her voice was different from any version of it he'd heard before. Not relief, not the simple exhale of a crisis passing, something more complicated, more layered. The voice of someone who has been holding a very heavy thing for a very long time and has just been allowed to put it down and is discovering that their arms are shaking. "Tell me," he said. She told him. She told him in the precise, sequenced way she told him things when she was being accurate rather than performative, which was the way he'd come to trust most. The board meeting had opened with the standard procedural items. Then Vivian's legal team had presented the evidence package. Derek Crane's statement, the shell company documentation, the registered agent records, the email chain that placed Marcus Hale as the authorizing party behind the surveillance, the media campaign, and Wednesday night's break-in attempt. Two of the board members who had been positioned to push for restructuring had gone pale and silent. The legal exposure alone, the potential liability for the board itself, if it voted in a direction that could later be characterized as acting on information from a hostile external campaign, had shifted the calculation fast. The vote on restructuring had failed, 4-3, then 5-2, when one of the wavering members reconsidered in real time. "And Hale?" Logan asked. "The SEC referral goes in today. My legal team is coordinating with the firm that represents 3 of his former contractors. It's bigger than just what happened to me. He's been doing versions of this for years." She paused. "It's going to be a very bad winter for Marcus Hale." "Good," Logan said, without any particular heat. "Just the word. Just accurate." Vivian was quiet for a moment. He could hear her breathing on the other end and the faint sounds of wherever she was. An office, a conference room, somewhere that wasn't home yet. "Logan," she said. "Yeah. I want to come home." He understood what she meant. She meant the mansion, the garden, the neighborhood. But she'd said home, and that word had weight. And he didn't address the weight directly because he didn't think this was the moment for it. "I'll be on the porch," he said. "Drive safe." She was back by 1:30. He heard the cars, 2 of them, which was fewer than the convoy that had arrived months ago. And he was on the porch with the sander set aside, and he watched the gate open and her walk through it, and she looked up and saw him and stopped for a moment on the sidewalk. She was tired. He could see it from here, not the managed exhaustion of someone maintaining control, but the real physical tiredness of someone who had been running on adrenaline for weeks and had just been allowed to stop. Her hair was loose. Her coat was the one she'd worn the morning the trucks arrived, the good one, and it looked slightly less perfect than it had then. He went down the porch steps and across the small front yard to the sidewalk. They stood about 4 feet apart on the pavement in the midday light, and she looked at him with the look that wasn't evaluative anymore, hadn't been for a while. The look he'd never quite been able to categorize because it was something closer to recognition than assessment. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. "I look terrible." "You look like someone who just won something," he said. She exhaled. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sigh. The sound of a pressure valve releasing. "I need to sleep for approximately 47 hours. Emma gets home at 3:15, he said. "You can sleep until then. She'll want to see you." Something moved in Vivian's face at that. Quickly, but he caught it. The particular movement of someone who has been prepared for loss and instead received something they weren't ready for. "Okay," she said. "Come on." He turned toward her gate. "I'll sit with you for a bit." They went inside. She slept for 3 hours on the couch in the front room, the one she'd apparently been using as a secondary office during the worst of it, because the desk near the window still had papers on it. Logan sat in the armchair across the room with a book he mostly didn't read, and watched the light move across the floor as the afternoon progressed, and occasionally looked at the woman asleep on the couch, who was not managing her face and looked, without the control, younger than 30 and exhausted in a way that was entirely human. He thought about the things you learn about people under pressure, how some people contracted, got smaller and harder and more internal when things got bad, how others expanded into chaos in ways that didn't help anyone, including themselves, and how a small category of people revealed something during difficulty that wasn't visible in ordinary circumstances, something that was just the essential material of who they were, stripped of the surface. He'd learned Vivian's essential material in increments over these months. The directness that wasn't coldness, but precision. The capacity for genuine attention. To Emma in the garden, to the plants she knew by Latin name, to the information he brought her, to the way he said things when he was being careful about what he said. The specific loneliness that looked from a distance like self-sufficiency and was, up close, the kind of aloneness that accumulates when you've spent your whole adult life being so capable that people forget to check whether you're okay. She woke up at 3:09 with the sudden alertness of someone who sets internal alarms. She sat up and looked at him and didn't look surprised that he was there, which he noted. "Emma," she said. "6 minutes," he said. She straightened, pushed her hair back, made an attempt at the composed face that was only partially successful, which was more human than the fully successful version. "Logan," she said. "Yeah." She looked at him with the look that didn't have a name yet. "The other night, what you said, that you knew what was in it." She stopped. "I've been thinking about it. I figured. I don't know how to do this," she said. "I want to be honest about that up front. I know how to run a company. I know how to build things from scratch and fight for them. I don't—" She looked at her hands. "I don't have a very good record with the other kind of thing." "I know," he said. "For what it's worth, I don't think my record is particularly impressive either." She looked up. "Rachel? We weren't right for each other. I think we knew it before Emma, and we decided not to know it. And then Emma came, and we tried harder, and it still wasn't right." He shrugged, because the accuracy of it had replaced most of the pain a long time ago. "It wasn't a disaster. It was just wrong. People stay in wrong things longer than they should." "I've never stayed in anything long enough to find out if it was wrong," she said. "I know that too." She was quiet. He heard the school bus from 2 blocks away. The particular sound of it, the air brakes at the corner, the familiar sequence that he'd been calibrated to for 4 years. "She's going to be here in about 90 seconds, he said. "I know." "Do you want to—" "Yes," Vivian said before he finished the sentence. She stood up. She smoothed her coat. The composed face was back, but it was the other kind of composed. Not the managed exterior she used for board meetings, but the steadiness of someone who was present and had decided to be present. "I want to see her." They went to the front door together. Emma came through the gate 30 seconds later at her standard velocity, which was the velocity of someone who had been stationary for 6 hours and was making up for it. She was 3 steps up the path before she saw Vivian in the doorway, and stopped. She looked at Vivian. She looked at Logan. She looked back at Vivian. Then she dropped her backpack on the path and ran the rest of the way and wrapped both arms around Vivian's waist. And Vivian, who Logan had watched maintain composure through a board meeting and a break-in attempt and weeks of sustained attack, put both arms around Emma and pressed her chin to the top of Emma's head and closed her eyes. Logan looked at the garden. He gave them a moment. It seemed like the right thing. That evening, they had dinner together in Logan's kitchen, which had started happening gradually over the past weeks and had somewhere along the way stopped feeling like an event and started feeling like a thing that happened. Logan made pasta, the kind he made when he needed something reliable, the sauce from a jar that Emma had decided was acceptable with enough Parmesan on top. Vivian sat at the counter and watched him cook and answered Emma's questions about the board meeting in the simplified but honest way she'd learned to calibrate for a 7-year-old. "So the bad guy got caught?" Emma said, with the directness of someone who had reduced the situation to its essential structure. "Something like that," Vivian said. "And he can't come after you anymore?" "Not for a long time." Emma nodded, satisfied with this. "Good. I didn't like the cameras outside." "Neither did I." "Will they go away now?" "They'll go away." Vivian looked at her. "Most things that feel permanent aren't." Emma considered this with the philosophical seriousness of a child processing new information. "Carol said something like that," she said. "She said bad weather always moves on." "Carol sounds smart." "She knows everything about everyone on the street," Emma said. "Dad says she's the neighborhood's unofficial newspaper." "He's not wrong," Logan said, putting a bowl of pasta in front of Emma. Emma started eating, then around a mouthful of pasta, in the completely unguarded way of children who say the truest thing at the exact moment when no one is ready for it. "Are you going to stay?" The kitchen was briefly very quiet. Vivian set down the glass she'd been holding. She looked at Emma, the full, careful look she gave things she was taking seriously. Do you want me to stay? Yes, Emma said simply. We like having you here. She paused and looked at Logan with the clear eyes that always saw more than he expected. Both of us do. Logan kept his attention on the pasta bowl in front of him, which he had already set down and had no real reason to be looking at. I'd like to stay, Vivian said. Her voice was steady, but there was something in it that hadn't been there before. Something that hadn't quite figured out how to exist at full volume yet, but was finding its way. I'd like that very much. Emma went back to her dinner, the matter settled. Logan finally looked up. Vivian was looking at him across the kitchen island with an expression that was open, was the word. Not vulnerable in the way that needed protecting. Just open in the way of someone who has put something down and is letting themselves be seen without it. He held her gaze for a moment. Good, he said. Just that. Good. Molto. The 2 weeks after the board meeting were quieter than any 2 weeks had been since the 17 trucks arrived. The news vans left by the second day. The story had pivoted, the way media stories did, from whatever narrative had been manufactured against Vivian to the far more interesting narrative of Marcus Hale and the Vertex Systems investigation, which had developed quickly enough to generate its own news cycle that had nothing to do with a residential neighborhood. The photographer on the corner packed up his long lens and didn't come back. The dark sedans stopped appearing. The neighborhood settled back into itself. Carol stopped parking around the corner. The dogs came back to the sidewalk. The gap in the fence got fixed. Logan had been putting it off for months, and he finally addressed it on a Saturday morning when the weather was clear and the wood he'd ordered had been sitting in his truck bed for 2 weeks. He replaced the boards properly, new wood, treated for weather, flush with the rest of the fence line. He left one board slightly loose on the far end, hinged, so it could swing open. This was not an accident. It was a decision he made without discussing it, without making anything of it, without acknowledging to anyone, including himself, that he'd done it. Emma noticed immediately. She tested the hinged board the first afternoon and looked at him with a knowing expression that was unsettling in a 7-year-old. Smart, she said. He didn't respond to that. The gate, as he'd started thinking of it, got used regularly. Usually Emma, in the afternoons, with the same loose interpretation of permission that she'd been running since the beginning. But also Vivian, evenings, the same way she'd come the night of the campfire, except now without the hesitation at the gap. She came through with the ease of someone who had gotten used to the motion, who had stopped treating it as a trespass and started treating it as a path. They didn't define anything. Logan noticed this and didn't push it, because he'd learned enough about Vivian by now to know that the things she'd built most solidly in her life were the things she'd been allowed to build at her own pace. She'd built a company that way, not by announcing what it would be, but by making daily decisions that accumulated into something real. He thought that probably this was how she built most things, incrementally, without fanfare, checking the levels as she went. He could work with that. He was good at incremental. What changed was subtle enough that he couldn't have pointed to a single moment. It was in the way she said his name, less careful than it had been, more like the way you said the name of someone you were accustomed to. It was in the way she showed up on the porch without the internal negotiation visible on her face. It was in the way Emma had started treating her as a fixed point in the landscape of their life, the way kids incorporated reliable things, not dramatically, not with announcement, just by folding them into the structure. Vivian had dinner at their table twice a week, then 3 times. Then it stopped being counted. She asked Logan one evening over the remains of a meal about his work, not politely. She'd moved past polite a while ago. She asked with the specific, focused attention she brought to things she actually wanted to understand. He explained the project he was currently on, a full renovation of a pre-war building in the east side of town, the kind of work that required reading what was behind the walls before you decided what to do with what was in front of them. That's what I like about old buildings, she said. They've already survived everything. You're just helping them keep going. He looked at her. You've built things from scratch your whole career. I have, she said. I've been thinking lately that there might be something to restoration. She said it lightly, but he knew her well enough now to understand that she didn't say things lightly. She said them carefully, and the lightness was the way she floated something to see if it held. It's different work, he said. More detective than architect. I might be good at that. I think you'd be very good at that, he said. Emma, who was supposed to be doing homework and was clearly not doing homework, looked up from the other side of the table. What are you two talking about? Work, Logan said. It didn't sound like work, Emma said, and went back to her notebook. Tick. It was on a Tuesday, ordinary in every way, 3 weeks after the board meeting, that Emma said the thing. She'd come back from school in an unusual mood. Not bad exactly, but quiet. The kind of quiet that in Emma signaled internal processing, something she was working through. Logan had let her be quiet through snack and through the first half hour of homework, which was the right call. Vivian had come through the fence gate in the late afternoon, which she'd started doing on her lighter work days, and was sitting at the kitchen table with a mug of tea and her laptop, doing something she'd described as catching up on the ordinary business of running a company, which apparently had been somewhat neglected during the crisis. She and Logan were in the kitchen, he was starting dinner, and Emma was at the table. It was just a Tuesday afternoon, an ordinary accumulation of people in a kitchen. Emma set down her pencil. She looked at Vivian for a moment, then at Logan, with the full weight of whatever she'd been carrying since school. Mia at school says her parents are a family, Emma said, because they all live together and do things together. Logan kept his eyes on the cutting board. Yeah, he said. She said that's what makes a family. People who do things together and live close. Emma paused. We do things together, and you live close. She looked at Vivian. If you go away, who's going to be our family? The kitchen was completely still. Logan set down the knife. He turned from the counter slowly. Vivian had gone very still at the table, not the managed stillness, something different. She was looking at Emma with an expression he had never seen on her before. Not composed, not open, not any of the versions he'd cataloged over these months, something rawer than all of them. Something that was happening to her face without her permission. Emma was waiting with the patient seriousness of a child who has asked a real question and intends to receive a real answer. Emma, Logan started. It's a real question, Emma said, not defensively, just explaining. I know it is. He looked at Vivian. Vivian was still looking at Emma. Her throat moved. She set down her mug with the careful precision of someone using the deliberate motion of a simple action to hold themselves together. I'm not going away, she said. Her voice was not entirely steady, and she didn't try to make it entirely steady, which was the most significant thing Logan had heard from her in 4 months. I told you that. You said you'd like to stay, Emma said. That's different from saying you're not going away. Vivian blinked. You're right, she said. It is different. She looked at Emma steadily, the way she looked at things she was taking completely seriously. I'm not going away. Is that better? Emma seemed to consider whether it was sufficient. Yes, she said. And then, with the complete non-ceremony of a child who has gotten the answer she needed and is ready to move on. Okay, what's for dinner? Logan turned back to the cutting board. He heard Vivian behind him, the small sound of her exhaling, slowly, the way you breathe out something you've been holding so long you'd stopped registering its weight. He heard the mug set down again. He heard the particular quiet of someone who has just had something crack open in them and is sitting with the crack rather than immediately sealing it. He finished chopping the onion. He put the pan on the heat. Logan, Vivian said. Yeah. I need to say something. He turned around. She was looking at him from the table. Her laptop was closed. Her hands were flat on the table surface, the deliberate posture of someone who has made a decision about what their body is going to do. I'm not good at this, she said. I need you to know that before anything else. I am genuinely, specifically not good at any of this. The staying, the being in someone else's space without preparing an exit strategy. She looked at him steadily. I have spent 10 years building things by controlling every variable I could identify and managing the ones I couldn't. And you are... She stopped, looked at the table, looked back up. You are not a variable I can manage. Neither is she. I know, he said. I'm not saying it as a complaint. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. I think I have been oriented toward you, is maybe the most honest way I can put it, for longer than I've been willing to say to myself. Since she thought about it. Since the roses, maybe. The first day, when you didn't look away. He looked at her now the same way he had then, directly, without the social reflex to break contact. Neither did you, he said. No, she said. Neither did I. Emma had gone entirely still at her side of the table, doing an extremely unconvincing impression of someone absorbed in homework. Emma, Logan said. I'm not listening, Emma said. You absolutely are. A pause. A little bit, she admitted. Go do your homework in your room for a few minutes. Emma weighed her options, decided this was reasonable, collected her things with the dignity of someone who is choosing to leave rather than being expelled, and went down the hall. They heard her door close. Not entirely closed. There was a 2-inch gap, very obviously. Vivian looked at the gap. She's going to hear everything. Yes, Logan said. She will. Does that bother you? He thought about it. No, he said. She already knows. She's known longer than we have. He came around the island and sat down across from her at the table, in Emma's chair, so they were at the same level. You said you don't know how to do this. I don't. I'm not going to ask you to know how, he said. I don't need you to know how. I just need you to... He looked at her. Be here. The way you've been here. That's all. She looked at him for a long, quiet moment. The kitchen smelled like onions and the beginning of whatever was in the pan, and somewhere down the hall Emma's pencil was making noise that was slightly too deliberate to be genuine homework. I told you I was going to leave, Vivian said. The night of the break-in, I'd already drafted a message to my real estate agent. I know. I wasn't thinking of it as giving up, she said. I was thinking of it as not being selfish. I know that too. He looked at her steadily. But you didn't leave. No. Why not? She held his gaze. Because Emma asked me not to, she said. In her way. A pause. And because you told me not to run. And because... She stopped. The last part cost something, visibly. Because I didn't want to. Okay, he said. Okay? Yeah. He held her gaze. We'll figure the rest out as we go. That's what people do. Vivian looked at him like he'd said something simple and true that she'd somehow missed until now, which was, he suspected, accurate. I'm not good at as we go, she said. I'll help, he said. Down the hall, Emma's pencil had stopped moving entirely. Vivian glanced at the door with the 2-inch gap. Then she looked back at Logan. And this time when the corner of her mouth moved, it wasn't the almost smile, the controlled edge of something contained. It was the real one. The one Emma had cataloged on the first day in the garden. The one that cost something to produce and was worth exactly that cost. She's going to be insufferable about being right, Vivian said quietly. She really is, Logan said. From down the hall, Emma's voice came through the 2-inch gap, entirely failing to sound like someone who hadn't heard every word. I'm not being insufferable. I'm just accurate. Well, Logan dropped his head. His shoulders shook with the effort of not laughing. Vivian laughed first, and it was so unexpected, so wholly unguarded, that Logan stopped trying to control his own and let it come. The sound of it moved through the kitchen like something breaking open in the best possible way, like the first warm day after a very long winter that everyone had been pretending wasn't hard. Down the hall, Emma's door opened the rest of the way. She came back to the kitchen with the satisfied expression of someone whose experiment has produced exactly the expected results, sat back down at her homework, and said nothing at all. She didn't need to. The evidence spoke for itself. Winter came slowly that year, the way it sometimes did in this part of the country, not with a single hard freeze that announced itself, but with a gradual cooling, mornings getting sharper, evenings arriving earlier, the light changing its quality from the horizontal gold of autumn to something thinner and more honest. Logan noticed it on job sites first, the way cold always announced itself in the materials. Wood contracting, metal running different under the hands, concrete setting faster. He'd been doing this work long enough that the seasons lived in his fingers before they registered anywhere else. The neighborhood settled around them like a house that had been aired out and was finding its temperature again. The last of the news presence had evaporated within a week of the board meeting. The Vertex Systems story had its own momentum now. Financial journalists who covered corporate malfeasance had picked it up properly, and the investigation into Marcus Hale's pattern of behavior across multiple companies over multiple years turned out to be a significantly larger story than the campaign against Vivian alone. Derek Crane's cooperation had opened doors that had been sealed for a long time. There were people in places Logan had never heard of who had been waiting years for someone to pull that specific thread, and now it was being pulled. And the whole thing was unraveling in public in the way that these things did when they finally gave way. Vivienne followed it closely, but with a different quality of attention than she'd had during the crisis. Then, she'd been tracking it the way you tracked something coming toward you. Now she tracked it the way you watched something move away. Still present, still engaged, but from a position of ground that was hers again. Logan noticed the difference in her face when she read the coverage. Less vigilant. More like someone watching weather from inside a window rather than standing in it. Sterling Nexus had a strong fourth quarter. The stock recovered. 3 of the executives who had been reported as preparing to jump ship publicly reaffirmed their commitment to the company, which was the kind of story that didn't generate the same headlines as the departure narrative, but mattered more in the end. Vivian flew to the company's headquarters twice in November, each time returning to the neighborhood like someone coming back to a place they'd decided on, not stumbling back to a default. Logan picked her up from the airport the second time, which was something that had not been discussed in advance and had happened because Emma had pointed out at dinner that Vivian always took car services, and that seemed lonely. He'd sent her a text. "Emma says car services are lonely. I'll be at arrivals at 7:15, she'd replied after a 2-minute pause. "I'm landing at 7. "I know. I'll be there at 7:15. Another pause. Then, "Okay." She'd come through the arrivals door with a carry-on and the coat and the particular expression of someone who had been managing things for 4 days straight and was ready to stop managing things. And she'd seen his truck at the curb and had stopped walking for just a moment, briefly, in a way that might have looked like nothing to anyone else. He'd gotten out and taken her bag, and she'd said, without preamble, "I miss the kitchen." "Just the kitchen?" he said. "And Emma," she said. "And the fence." She paused. "And you, obviously." "Obviously," he said. They drove home through the dark with the radio on low, and neither of them talking very much. And it was the easiest 40 minutes Logan had spent in as long as he could remember. December arrived, and with it the particular domestic accumulation of a holiday season inside a life that had reorganized itself around new shapes. Emma had opinions about Christmas decorations that she expressed with the full force of her considerable conviction, which meant that Logan's small house was more decorated than it had ever been, including a strand of lights along the porch railing that she'd insisted on and that he'd installed on a Saturday afternoon while she directed from the yard with architectural authority. Vivian had watched this process from the gap in the fence with a mug of tea and an expression that she probably didn't know was as transparent as it was. "You could come help instead of supervising," Logan said. "I'm not supervising. I'm observing." "Emma, is she supervising?" Emma from the yard considered the question seriously. "A little bit," she said, "but she looks like she wants to help." Vivian came through the gate and Logan handed her a strand of lights. That was how it worked mostly, not with grand gestures or formal declarations, with handed strands of lights, with seats saved at the kitchen table, with the gradual porousness of 2 households that had stopped behaving like separate things. Vivian's mansion had been beautiful when she moved in. Professionally staged, perfectly appointed, every room exactly right in the way of rooms that haven't been lived in yet. Over the months it had changed, not dramatically, not obviously, but in the small specific ways of a place that is being used by a person who is becoming someone. There were muddy garden gloves by the back door now. There was a hook near the kitchen entrance with a purple parka that belonged to Emma, installed there because Emma had started spending occasional weekend mornings in the garden and needed somewhere to put her coat. There was a drawing on the refrigerator, one of Emma's, a rose with a black center she'd labeled "Black Back Cara" in pencil. The spelling approximate but committed. Logan had seen the drawing go up on the refrigerator one Wednesday evening and had found that he couldn't look at it for too long without something happening in his chest that he didn't try to name, because naming it felt like it would make it smaller than it was. He thought about his daughter a lot in these months, about the specific way she'd moved through all of this, the crisis, the changes, the gradual reordering of their ordinary life, with the sure-footed adaptability of children who are securely rooted and can therefore bend without breaking. She'd been frightened by the note on the gate. He knew. She hadn't said so directly, but she'd slept badly for a week, and she'd stopped walking alone to the bus stop without asking him to come. And there had been a few evenings when she'd been quieter than usual in the way that meant something was sitting on her. But she'd processed it the way she processed most hard things, by sitting with it until it was a smaller size, by asking the questions that mattered to her and accepting the honest answers, by finding her ground again and going back to caring about the things she cared about. The garden, her soccer practice, the bulb she'd planted, which had produced a flower in late October, a small yellow one, that she'd photographed 17 times and made Logan look at from 7 different angles. The note had scared her, but it hadn't moved her. That was Emma. Logan thought sometimes about Rachel in this period in a way that was cleaner than it had been in a while. He thought about the marriage and what it had been and what it hadn't been, and he thought that the failure of it had taught him something he might not have learned any other way, that the wrong fit, maintained with effort, produced a kind of exhaustion that felt like an ordinary state because you'd been in it long enough to forget what the other thing felt like, and that the other thing, when it finally showed up, was identifiable precisely because it didn't require that particular effort. It required different things, but not that. He didn't know if Vivian was the right fit. He knew it felt different. He knew that spending an evening with her left him with more energy than he'd started with rather than less, which was not something he'd been able to say about most sustained relationships in his adult life. He knew that she made him think more carefully about things, not because she demanded it, but because being around someone who thought carefully was contagious. And he knew that Emma, who was a canary for everything, had incorporated her into their life with the naturalness of breathing, which was the most reliable indicator Logan had. He kept the knowledge carefully, the way you kept good wood. Not in conditions that would warp it, not pushed or pressured, just maintained at the right temperature and allowed to be what it was. The Vertex Systems case reached its first major resolution in February. Marcus Hale resigned from Vertex's board in January under pressure from institutional shareholders who had reviewed the evidence compiled by Vivian's legal team and the SEC investigators. He issued a statement through a public relations firm that was notable primarily for its completeness in avoiding any actual accountability, which Logan read once and didn't read again. The resignation was the domino. By February, 2 senior Vertex executives had been named in the SEC investigation, a third had hired separate counsel, and the acquisition strategy that had been pointed at Sterling Nexus like a weapon for the better part of a year had collapsed into the kind of internal chaos that tended to preclude any aggressive external action. Vivian told Logan about the Hale resignation by leaving a note in the kitchen, his kitchen, where she'd taken to making coffee on mornings when she arrived early enough that he was still getting Emma ready for school. The note said, "He's gone. The board voted this morning. Thought you should hear it in a way that didn't involve a screen." She'd signed it with her initial, just V, in handwriting that was precise and angular like the rest of her. He'd read it standing at the counter in his work jacket, Emma's backpack on the floor, Emma eating cereal at the table with her eyes on a library book. He'd folded the note and put it in his jacket pocket and finished packing Emma's lunch and driven her to school and come home and sat at the kitchen table with the note on the table in front of him, reading it again. Thought you should hear it in a way that didn't involve a screen. He thought about that for a while. About someone who ran a technology company, who lived on screens professionally, who had chosen to put something important on paper and leave it somewhere it would be found by hand. He thought about what that meant, the particular effort of it, and the understanding behind it. That she knew how he received things, that she'd paid enough attention to know the difference. He texted her, "I got it." She replied, "Good." He stared at his phone for a moment. Then he typed, "I'm proud of you." The reply took longer this time, almost 5 minutes. He was about to put the phone down when it came. That means more than you know. He put the phone down. He went to work. He had a building to help keep going. Spring arrived the way it always did after a hard winter. Not all at once, not with ceremony, but in the unmistakable incremental accumulation of small warmth, each day fractionally longer than the last, the garden coming back before the rest of the world had caught up to the idea. Emma noticed the shoots coming through the soil in Vivian's garden before either of the adults did and reported them with the satisfaction of a scientist whose hypothesis has been confirmed. The bulb had come back. There were two other things coming up in places Emma had planted things in November that Vivian had promised would return. They returned. "I told you," Emma said, to no one in particular on a Sunday morning, standing in the garden in her purple parka with muddy knees. "You told us," Vivian agreed, standing behind her with her own mug of tea and her hair down, the coat she wore in the garden, the gardening gloves that had significantly more wear on them than they'd had in the fall. "Things come back," Emma said, with the profound simplicity of a child who has understood something and is announcing it. Vivian looked at Logan over Emma's head. He was leaning against the garden wall with his coffee, watching his daughter crouch over a small green shoot with the intensity of a naturalist documenting a discovery. He and Vivian held each other's gaze for a moment in the spring morning, the garden between them and around them, and he thought, yes, things come back. He thought about a fence with a gap that had become a gate. He thought about a woman who had arrived with 17 trucks and one plan, solitude, and had found something that wasn't solitude at all, something that was harder and better, and had caught her off guard in the way that the most important things generally did. He thought about himself, which he did less often, but honestly, about the version of him that had been perfectly competent at managing a small, structured, sufficient life, and what had happened to that version when a pair of dark eyes hadn't looked away. "What are you thinking about?" Vivian asked. She was watching him. "Work stuff," he said. "You're lying," she said. "A little bit," he said. She almost laughed. The real one, the one that cost something. It was becoming less rare, he'd noticed. The real laugh was becoming closer to the surface, requiring less excavation. He took credit for some of that. Emma took credit for most of it. The block party was Carol's idea, as most things in the neighborhood social calendar were Carol's idea. She announced it in May with the same energy she brought to all her organizational initiatives. A hand-lettered flyer distributed to every mailbox on the block, a sign-up sheet for food contributions, and a personal verbal follow-up with each household to ensure compliance, which in Carol's vocabulary meant enthusiasm. Logan signed up to bring potato salad, which he'd been bringing to block parties since he'd moved to the neighborhood and had no intention of changing. Emma signed up, on her own initiative, to bring brownies, which meant Logan made the brownies while Emma provided artistic direction. Vivian read the flyer 3 times before she mentioned it. "I don't know anyone here," she said, "except you and Carol." "Carol knows everything," Logan said. "She'll introduce you." "I'm aware that Carol knows everything. That's what concerns me." "She's not going to ask you about the company," he said. "She's going to ask you about the garden, because she's been watching it improve for months and she has opinions. And then she's going to tell you about her son in Sacramento, whether you ask or not. And then she's going to give you a recipe for something, and then you'll be fine." Vivian looked at him. "You sound like you've run this analysis before." "I've been going to Carol's block parties for 4 years. I know the arc." She looked at the flyer again. "What do I bring?" "Whatever you want." Logan. "Vivian, I have never attended a block party in my life," she said. "I need a specific recommendation." He thought about it. "Cornbread," he said. "Not from a box. She knows the difference." Vivian made cornbread from scratch the morning of the party, in Logan's kitchen, following a recipe with the focused precision she brought to everything, tasting it twice, adjusting, tasting again, and producing something that was, frankly, better cornbread than Logan had managed in years of attempting it. He did not point this out. He simply ate the test piece she offered him and said, "That's good." She looked at the pan. "It's not perfect. Cornbread isn't supposed to be perfect. It's supposed to be good." She considered this. "Okay," she said. The party spread across 3 connected driveways and the stretch of street between them, the way block parties in this neighborhood always did. Tables dragged from backyards, mismatched lawn chairs, the specific democratic chaos of a shared meal. It was a Saturday afternoon in late June, warm but not oppressive. The light, that particular long summer evening light that made everything look slightly better than it actually was. Carol, as predicted, found Vivian within 4 minutes. Logan watched from a safe distance as Carol did exactly what he'd described, led with the garden, transitioned to the sun in Sacramento, produced a business card for a specialty plant nursery she wanted Vivian to have. Vivian navigated it with a grace that wasn't manufactured, that was the real kind, the patience of someone who had decided to be present and was following through on the decision. She listened to Carol. She asked one question about the nursery that was specific enough to be genuine. She smiled at the appropriate moments, not the outside smile, the real one. Logan turned away and went to get Emma a drink from the cooler. Emma was in the middle of a cluster of neighborhood kids. She knew all of them, of course, because she knew the whole neighborhood the way she knew everything in her world, thoroughly and without apparent effort. And she was explaining something at length that Logan couldn't quite hear, and the other kids were listening with the specific attention of people who understand that this particular narrator is reliable. He watched her for a moment. 8 years old, almost 8 and a half, already carrying herself with the quiet confidence of someone who has been told by the people who matter most that she is worth paying attention to and has believed them. He thought about all the ways he'd failed as a father, the mornings he'd been too tired, the evenings he'd been too distracted, the times he'd said not right now when right now was actually what was needed. He thought about them with the particular honesty that he tried to apply to his own ledger, without excusing them and without letting them be the whole story. The whole story was the kid across the yard explaining something to other children with authority and warmth. He'd done enough right to produce that. Not perfectly, but enough. Vivian found him a while later, somewhere between the potato salad and the sunset. She appeared at his shoulder with a cup of lemonade and stood beside him looking at the party, the tables, the people, the specific comfortable noise of a neighborhood that had decided to be a neighborhood together for an afternoon. Carol gave me a recipe, she said. For what? Zucchini bread. She seemed very sincere about it. She's very sincere about all her recipes. Did she mention her garden? At length. Vivian sipped her lemonade. She looked at ease in a way he hadn't seen at the beginning, not performing ease, actually in it, actually here rather than adjacent to here. She told me I should put in a zucchini bed. You should. She'll give you starts in spring. I know. She already offered. A pause. She also told me you've been a good neighbor for 4 years and that Emma is the best thing to happen to this block since they repaved the street. Logan looked at his shoes. That sounds like Carol. She said something else. Vivian's voice shifted slightly. Not serious exactly, more careful. She said she was glad you'd finally stopped looking like someone who'd made peace with being alone. The party noise continued around them. Someone across the street was laughing at something. Emma's voice carried over everything, still explaining, still holding her audience. Logan didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How did you respond to that?" I said I was glad too. She paused. She patted my hand. She does that. It was surprisingly not terrible. He looked at her sideways. She was watching the party with the particular quality of attention she brought to things she was deciding to let mean something. Not passive watching, but the active kind. The kind where you're allowing the experience to land instead of keeping it at managed distance. He thought about all of the months. The 17 trucks and the cold coffee and the soccer ball and the roses and the campfire marshmallow and the note on the gate post and the men in the rain and the board meeting and the note on his kitchen counter that said, "Thought you should hear it in a way that didn't involve a screen." He thought about the gap in the fence that had become a gate and the gate that had become a path and the path that had become something that didn't need to be named anymore because it was simply the way between two places that were, for practical purposes, one place. He thought, I should have done the fence sooner. He thought, no, the timing was right. It was almost 8 o'clock when the lights started going amber and horizontal, and some of the families with younger children began packing up. Emma had found her way back to them, stationed between them in the particular way she had of positioning herself in the exact center of whatever felt most like home, and she was eating the last of a brownie she'd retrieved from the contribution table and watching the evening with the satisfied expression of a person who has had a good day and knows it. Logan had been carrying something in his jacket pocket since March. He'd bought it in March, without plan or announcement, at a small jewelry shop in the east side of the city. Not impulsively. He was rarely impulsive, but after a Saturday morning in the garden, when Vivian had been showing Emma how to identify the difference between a healthy root system and a compromised one, crouched in the dirt in her gardening gloves, explaining something with the patient specificity of someone who had turned expertise into care, and Logan had been watching from the bench by the pond and had understood with the completeness of a thing that had been building for months that he was not going to find a better version of this than this. That this was already it. He'd put the ring in his pocket in March. He'd carried it since then. Not because he was waiting for the right moment. He wasn't a man who believed particularly in the myth of the right moment, because the right moment was usually the moment you made rather than the one you waited for. He was carrying it because he was still checking his levels, still making sure the structure was sound before he committed weight to it. That was how he built things. He checked until he was sure, and then he moved. He was sure. Emma finished her brownie. The sun was most of the way down, the sky going from orange to the deep blue-gray of summer evening. The strings of lights Carol had organized along the party perimeter had flickered on, warm yellow against the coming dark. "Hey," Logan said. Vivian turned. He looked at her. The full look. No distance in it. Nothing managed. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the first morning on the driveway when he hadn't looked away fast enough, which had turned out to be exactly right. He reached into his jacket pocket. He was aware of Emma going very still beside him, which meant Emma had seen the pocket, because Emma saw everything and was doing the calculation at the speed she did all calculations. "Logan," Vivian said. Her voice had gone quiet. "I'm not good at speeches," he said. "I thought about one. I didn't get very far." He held the ring in his closed hand for a moment. "You moved in next door and my daughter thought you were a queen, and she was more right than she knew. You were lonely in a way that most people couldn't see, and you were fighting something that would have beaten most people. And you did it without asking for help until I more or less insisted on giving it to you." He paused. "And somewhere in the middle of all of that, without either of us planning it, you became the person I think about when I'm deciding how to do things. You became the person Emma draws flowers for and leaves on your refrigerator. You became—" He stopped. "You became the thing that makes this make sense." Vivian was looking at him with an expression that was entirely unmanaged, entirely hers, the version of her that existed before the composure and underneath it and would exist after it. Her eyes were bright. "I'm not easy," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady, and she didn't try to make it steady. "I know. I work too much. I don't know how to not be in control of things. I'm going to get it wrong in ways I haven't figured out how to predict yet." "I know all of that," he said. "I'm not asking for a different version of you. I'm asking for the one standing in front of me." Beside him, Emma had not moved or breathed in approximately 45 seconds. He opened his hand. The ring was simple, and he'd chosen it that way, not because simple was cheaper, but because Vivian was not a person who needed addition to be significant, who was at her most real when things were stripped down to what they actually were. A clear stone, clean setting, good metal. The kind of thing that lasted. "Vivian Sterling," he said, "will you marry me?" He didn't make it a question exactly. He said it the way he said things he meant fully, not with the upward inflection of uncertainty, just the words themselves, solid and flat and absolutely true. The party continued around them, and the lights were warm, and the summer evening was holding its last heat, and Emma's brownie had been set down somewhere and forgotten. Vivian looked at the ring. She looked at his face. She looked at Emma, who was standing rigid with the suppressed energy of a child trying very hard not to explode prematurely, and she looked back at Logan. "Yes," she said. It was the simplest version of the answer, and it was the right one. Emma did explode. There was no other word for it. She launched herself at both of them simultaneously, which was a physical feat that required them to come together in order to catch her, which was probably the intention, and she wrapped her arms around both of their waists and pressed her face into the gap between them and made a sound that was not quite crying and not quite laughing, but somewhere in the specific frequency of a child who has gotten the exact thing they most wanted and is overwhelmed by the accuracy of it. From somewhere nearby, Carol said, loudly and without apology, "Oh, finally!" which produced a burst of laughter from the section of the party that had been quietly watching. Because, of course, they had been watching. Because Carol had been watching. And Carol had told anyone who'd listen that something was going on with the house on the end. And then there was the specific warm noise of a neighborhood doing what neighborhoods occasionally got to do, which was witness something good and respond to it accordingly. Logan put the ring on Vivian's finger. His hands were not entirely steady, which surprised him and also didn't. She looked at it on her hand for a moment. "It's perfect," she said. "I thought you said things couldn't be perfect." "I'm updating my position," she said. He laughed. She laughed. Emma was still attached to both of them, face pressed between them, and she said, muffled, "I've been waiting for this since October." "October," Vivian said. "You were 8 years old in October." "Ah, I knew in October," Emma said, with complete confidence. "You just took longer." "She's not wrong," Logan said. "She's never wrong," Vivian said. "It's genuinely alarming." Emma finally unburied her face. She looked up at both of them in the warm light with the expression of someone who has seen a thing through to its correct conclusion, which was satisfaction without smugness, or close enough. "I told you," she said. "What did you tell us?" Logan asked. "That things come back." She looked between them. "And that we needed a family." The sky had gone full dark by now except for the western edge where the last of the light was holding on, doing what last light did, going slowly, giving you enough time to notice it before it was gone. The strings of warm lights made the party into a pocket of amber in the summer evening, and the neighborhood was all around them, and Emma was between them where she'd positioned herself from the beginning, and Logan thought about all the different ways a life could go, all the various shapes that sufficient and good and fine could take. All the versions of this is enough that a person could settle into and not be wrong about exactly, just not completely right either. He thought about a driveway and cold coffee and 17 trucks and a pair of eyes that hadn't looked away. He thought that the most important arrivals in a life rarely looked like arrivals at the time. They looked like a car parking. They looked like a kid kicking a ball in the wrong direction. They looked like standing in the rain at 2 in the morning because the alternative was standing somewhere else, which was unacceptable. They looked like ordinary Tuesdays with cold feet and bad dreams and the slow accumulation of a life that was turning into something you hadn't planned and couldn't have designed. There was something he'd come to understand across these months, slowly, in the way that real understanding always came, not as revelation but as gradual recognizing, like a shape emerging from fog. It was something about the difference between what you built on purpose and what you found when you stopped being so certain about what you were building. He'd built his life with precision, with structure, with the careful level checking of a man who'd learned that things fell down when you didn't pay attention to the load-bearing elements. And that wasn't wrong. Structure mattered, foundations mattered. You couldn't build anything worth having on nothing. But what he'd found, what had come through a gap in a fence that he kept not getting around to fixing, that was the other thing. That was the thing that structure alone couldn't produce, the thing that had to arrive on its own or not at all. The warmth that Emma had identified from the beginning, the real smile that cost something, the woman who had built a billion-dollar empire and still didn't know how to be in a kitchen without watching the door. Nobody comes through life without carrying their damage. Rachel had hers, Logan had his, Vivian had hers in ways that the profiles and the board presentations and the public persona would never fully map. The damage was not the thing to overcome. The damage was part of the material. You worked with it the way you worked with old buildings, not pretending it wasn't there, not letting it be the whole story, finding what was sound underneath it, building from there. Emma had known. She'd known in October, she said, and he believed her because Emma had been reading the essential materials of people since she was old enough to notice that some smiles were for the outside and some were for the real. What Emma had known was this, that the woman who moved in next door with 17 trucks and guarded gates and a composed face for every occasion was not made for solitude, regardless of how efficiently she'd organized it, and that her father, who had built a sufficient life around a single perfect thing and had quietly stopped expecting anything else, was not finished, regardless of how much he'd stopped expecting. Children knew things. It was worth listening to them. Logan looked at Vivian in the warm light of the party, the ring on her finger, his daughter between them, the neighborhood around them doing its ordinary living. He looked at her the way he'd been looking at her since the beginning, which was with the full attention of someone who had stopped pretending not to notice. She looked back. "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. Same as the first time. Same 2 words, completely different weight. Carol started organizing people into a toast. She had produced a bottle of something from somewhere, because of course she had, because Carol was a woman of preparation and had been waiting for this particular moment for months. And the party shifted and gathered, and Emma stood between them and accepted a glass of lemonade with the gravity of someone participating in a significant event. And the evening held, and the lights were warm, and the neighborhood that had watched all of it, the trucks arriving, the cameras gathering, the storm and the fear and the slow, unannounced rebuilding, was present for this too, which was the way of neighborhoods that had decided to be places rather than just addresses. Some people spent their whole lives looking for home in the obvious places, in achievement, in security, in the things that could be built with precision and defended with documentation. And those things mattered. Logan would never say they didn't. Structure mattered. Work mattered. The daily ordinary effort of keeping things standing mattered. But home was not a structure. Home was what happened inside it. The cold feet at 5 in the morning and the bad dreams that couldn't be described and the lunches with the crusts cut off and the marshmallow over the fire and the cornbread that was good but not perfect and the garden that came back every spring and the kid who knew everything before the adults caught up and the gap in the fence that nobody fixed because nobody actually wanted to. Home was what you built in the spaces between your plans. Vivian Sterling had moved in next door on a Tuesday with 17 trucks and not a single friend. She left with a family.